In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a young wife, Eleanor Trent, is found dead in her ivy-clad cottage, her heart stilled too soon. Was it a tragic illness or something darker? Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet knitting and sharper mind, unravels a web of greed, poison, and betrayal. A charming husband with mounting debts, a shadowy caretaker with a thief's past, and a hidden letter naming them both. Every whisper in the village points to murder. Can Miss Marple trap the killers before they flee with a fortune? Dive into the case of the caretaker, where secrets bloom like roses and truth cuts like thorns. Chapter 1. The death at Willow Cottage. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a fold of the downs, its thatched roofs and tidy gardens basking in the pale light of an autumn dawn. Willow Cottage, a charming relic of older days, stood apart. At the end of Lilac Lane, its walls cloaked in ivy and its chimneys puffing faint wisps of smoke. To the casual eye, it was a picture of pastoral peace. But on this particular morning, October the 12th, a shadow hung over the cottage, as tangible as the mist curling through the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her drawing-room with a lat full of soft blue wool, paused her knitting to glance out the window. Her view commanded the heart of the village, the post office, the vicarage, and the narrow lane leading to Willow Cottage. She had been up early, as was her habit, when her maid, Lily, burst in with the news, her round face flushed with the importance of her tidings. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," Lily exclaimed, clutching her apron. "Mrs. Trent Morris, Eleanor Trent, up at Willow Cottages, dead. Found this morning, stiff as a board, in her bed. Dr. Haydock's been called, but they're saying it's her heart." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm, but her eyes, sharp and clear behind her spectacles, fixed on Lily. "Her heart, you say? Dear me, how very sudden. Mrs. Trent was young, was she not?" "Only 28, Miss Lily," said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "And such a beauty, with her golden hair and fine dresses. Married to Mr. Charles Trent not 2 years past. Folk thought her frail, but she was lively enough at the harvest supper last week, dancing with the vicar's nephew." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the fragments of village life. Eleanor Trent had come to St. Mary Mead as a bride, her fortune the subject of much speculation. Charles Trent, a man of polished manners and easy charm, had won her hand swiftly, and their life at Willow Cottage seemed ideal. Yet Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for the undercurrents beneath polite surfaces, had sensed a restlessness in Eleanor, a flicker of unease in her bright smile. Was anyone with her when she was found? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Lily hesitated, then leaned closer. "That's the queer thing, Miss. It was Mr. Hodges, the caretaker, who raised the alarm. Mrs. Price, the charwoman, says she saw him coming out of the cottage at first light, looking all wild-eyed. He fetched Dr. Haydock straight away, but by then poor Mrs. Trent was gone." "Mr. Hodges," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing again. The caretaker was a recent addition to the village, a wiry man of indeterminate age with a habit of keeping to himself. He lived in a small lodge on the Trent estate, tending the gardens and performing odd jobs. His arrival, some 6 months prior, had stirred mild curiosity, but St. Mary Mead was accustomed to newcomers. Still, Miss Marple had noted his solitary ways, the way his gaze lingered too long on Parsby. "What do folks say about it, Lily?" she asked, knowing the village's pulse beat strongest in its gossip. Lily's eyes widened. Some say it's natural, miss, her heart giving out like that. But others, well, Mrs Bantry was at the post office, and she said it's odd, Mr Trent not being there when it happened. He was away in London, they say, on business. And then there's Mr Hodges, always skulking about. Mrs Price swears she heard a cry from the cottage late last night, but it might have been a fox. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Mrs Price's imagination was as vivid as her scrubbing was thorough, but a cry in the night was not to be dismissed. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Lily. I think I shall take a turn about the village. The air will do me good. As Lily bustled off to the kitchen, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her mind alert. She stepped into the crisp morning, her steps light despite her years. The lane was alive with whispers neighbours, clustered in doorways, their voices hushed, but eager. At the post office, Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was holding court. Her pince-nez glinting as she recounted the tragedy to a rapt audience. Heart failure, that's what Dr. Haydock said, Miss Weatherby declared. But I saw Mrs. Trent only yesterday, buying stamps. She looked pale, I grant you, but not ailing. And that caretaker Hodges, is it? He was in here last week, asking for a parcel. Shifty, if you ask me. Miss Marple listened, her expression one of polite interest, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Heart failure in a woman of 28 was not impossible, but it was rare. And the presence of Mr. Hodges at dawn, the absence of Charles Trent, the cry in the night, these were threads in a tapestry yet to be woven. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, a sudden death that proved less natural than it seemed. People, she knew, were seldom what they appeared, and Willow Cottage held secrets she intended to unravel as she passed the churchyard. Miss Marple glanced toward Willow Cottage, its windows dark against the ivy. A figure moved in the garden, Mr. Hodges, his pruning shears glinting in the weak sunlight. He looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Miss Marple smiled, a gentle, disarming smile, but her heart quickened. The game, she sensed, had begun. Chapter 2. The grieving husband, the sun, had barely crested the hills of St. Mary Mead when the village began to stir with the weight of its newest tragedy. Willow Cottage, once a beacon of quiet elegance, now seemed to crouch under a pall of suspicion, its chimneys silent and its windows shuttered. The death of Mrs. Eleanor Trent had set tongues wagging, and by midday the air was thick with speculation. Miss Jane Marple, her morning walk concluded, returned to her cottage and settled into her armchair, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the clamour of her thoughts. The news of Eleanor's death was troubling enough, but it was the figure of Charles Trent, her husband, that now occupied her mind. Charles Trent was a man who, in the 2 years since his arrival in St. Mary Mead, had carved a place for himself with the ease of a born charmer. Tall, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes that crinkled with practiced warmth, he had won the village's approval as readily as he had won Eleanor's hand. His manners were impeccable, his conversation engaging, and his devotion to his young wife apparent to all. Yet Miss Marple, whose observations of human nature were as keen as her stitches were precise, had always sensed a studied quality to his charm, a performance too polished to be wholly sincere. Lily, bustling in with a tray of tea, provided the morning's second report. "Mr. Trent's back from London, miss," she said, setting the teapot down with a clink. "Came in on the early train, they say, and went straight to Willow Cottage. Mrs. Price saw him at the gate, looking proper. "Broken," she said, though he didn't stop to talk. "The inquest's set for tomorrow, and folk are saying he'll speak to it." Miss Marple poured her tea, the steam curling in the cool air. "Broken, you say? Well, that is to be expected. And yet, Lily, it is curious that he was away when it happened. Business in London, was it?" "So he says," Lily replied, her tone hinting at skepticism. Mrs Bantry was at the butcher's, and she heard Mr Trent had been gone 2 days. Left the day before Mrs Trent was found, and didn't come back till now. Some folk think it's odd, him not being there when she took ill. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant. Odd, indeed. A husband's absence at such a moment was not in itself suspicious, but it was a detail to be tucked away, like a stray thread in her knitting. She recalled Charles at the summer fete, his arm around Eleanor, his laughter ringing out as he tossed a ring at the bottle stall. Eleanor had smiled, but her eyes had wandered, as if searching for something beyond the gaiety. Miss Marple had noted it then, and she noted it now. The inquest, held the following day in the village hall, was a sombre affair. The room, usually reserved for whist drives and amateur theatricals, was packed with villagers, their curiosity cloaked in respectful silence. Miss Marple, seated near the back with her friend Mrs Bantry, observed the proceedings with her usual unobtrusive attention. The coroner, a brisk man from Dannemouth, called Charles Trent to the stand first, and the room leaned forward as one. Charles rose, his dark suit immaculate, his face pale but composed. He took the oath with a steady voice, and when asked to recount the events leading to his wife's death, he spoke with a clarity that bordered on rehearsal. Eleanor had not been well for some time, he said, his hands clasped before him. She had a heart condition, diagnosed in her youth, though she bore it bravely. "I was in London on business, sir, matter of investments, when I received word of her passing. I returned at once, but it was too late. Miss Marple's needles, hidden in her bag, would have clicked faster had she been knitting." Charles's words were smooth, his grief convincing, yet there was something in his posture, a slight rigidity, a too careful choice of phrase that struck her as calculated. She glanced at Mrs Bantry, whose eyebrows had risen a fraction. A silent agreement that all was not as it seemed. The coroner pressed gently. "Mr Trent, were you aware of any recent deterioration in your wife's health?" Charles hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he recovered. She was tired, perhaps, but nothing alarming. Eleanor was delicate, but she managed her condition with care. Her medicines were always at hand, prescribed by Dr Haydock. Dr Haydock, called next, confirmed the heart condition, though his testimony was cautious. Mrs Trent had a murmur noted some years ago, he said, adjusting his glasses. It was not severe, and with rest she lived comfortably. Her death was sudden, likely a failure of the heart during the night. I found no external signs of distress. Miss Marple's lips pursed. No external signs, but what of internal ones? She recalled a conversation with Dr Haydock years ago, when he had spoken of poisons that mimicked natural death, leaving little trace unless one knew where to look. Her eyes drifted to the back of the room, where Mr Hodges, the caretaker, stood against the wall. His face was impassive, his cap clutched in his hands, but his gaze was fixed on Charles. For a moment their eyes met, and Miss Marple caught a flash of something complicity, perhaps, or fear. The coroner, satisfied with the medical evidence, called no further witnesses. The verdict was swift, death by natural causes, with heart failure as the likely culprit. The room exhaled, and the villagers filed out, their whispers resuming with renewed vigour. Miss Marple lingered, her shawl draped over her shoulders. As Charles shook hands with the vicar, his expression one of dignified sorrow. Hodges had vanished, slipping out before the crowd. Mrs Bantry, ever eager for a confidant, linked arms with Miss Marple as they stepped into the sunlight. "Well, Jane, what do you make of it? Charles Trent cuts a fine figure, doesn't he? All that grief, so perfectly played. But I can't help thinking there's more to this than a weak heart." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes scanning. The lane, grief, Dolly, is a curious thing. Some wear it like a cloak, others like a mask. Mr Trent is a man who knows how to present himself, but I wonder what lies beneath. They parted at the post office, and Miss Marple made her way to the high street, her steps slow but purposeful. The village was abuzz, and she let the chatter wash over her, each snippet a piece of the puzzle. At the baker's, Mrs Clement, the vicar's wife, spoke of Eleanor's kindness, her gifts to the church fund. At the grocer's, Mr Polk, the constable, mentioned Charles's frequent trips to London, always on business that seemed vague. And at the tea shop, Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, dropped a tantalizing hint. "I saw Mr Trent posting a letter the day he left," she said, her voice low over her scone. Thick envelope, addressed to a firm in London. Looked important, but he was in a hurry, didn't stop to chat. And that Hodges fellow, he was with him, carrying a parcel. Odd pair, if you ask me. Miss Marple thanked her and ordered a pot of Earl Grey, her mind turning over the new information. A letter, a parcel, and Hodges's presence, small details, but significant. She thought of Charles's demeanour at the inquest, the way his eyes had sought Hodges in the crowd. There was a connection there, one she could not yet define, but felt as surely as the weight of her knitting bag. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mrs Price, the charwoman who had first seen Hodges at Willow Cottage. Mrs Price, a stout woman with a penchant for dramatics, welcomed her into a cluttered parlour, her eyes gleaming with the chance to recount her tale. "It was just dawn, Miss Marple, and I was on my way to the cottage to light the fires. There was Mr Hodges coming out the front door, his face white as chalk. He said Mrs Trent was dead, and I must fetch Dr Haydock. I near fainted, I did. Did you see Mr Trent?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. "No, miss. He was still in London, or so Hodges said. But I'll tell you what I told Polk. There was something queer about that cottage. The air felt wrong, like someone had been up to no good. And that Hodges, he's not right. Always watching, never speaking." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing Mrs Price's impressions. The charwoman's flair for exaggeration was well known, but her instincts were often sound. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs Price added a final detail. "One thing, Miss Si found a handkerchief in the hall near Mrs Trent's room, silk, with a monogram, not hers nor Mr Trent's. I gave it to Hodges, but he just stuffed it in his pocket." A handkerchief, Miss Marple thought, could mean nothing or everything. She thanked Mrs Price and stepped back into the fading light, her thoughts racing. Charles Trent's grief, so carefully displayed, did not align with the man who left. For London days before his wife's death, his connection to Hodges, the caretaker's early presence at the cottage, the letter, the parcel, the handkerchief, these were threads, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them into a pattern. That evening, as she sat by her fire, her knitting a soft rhythm in her hands, Miss Marple considered the nature of performance. Charles Trent was an actor, she decided, playing the role of the grieving husband with skill. But every actor had a script, and every script had a purpose. She thought of Eleanor, her beauty and her wealth, and of the fortune that now passed to her husband. Wealth, Miss Marple knew, was a motive as old as time, and Charles Trent was a man who bore watching. As the clock struck 9, a knock came at her door. Lily, flustered, announced a visitor, Dr. Haydock, his face grave. "Jane," he said, settling into a chair. "I've been thinking about Eleanor Trent. There's something about her death that doesn't sit right. I can't put my finger on it, but I thought you might have an idea." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "An idea, doctor, perhaps. But I shall need a little more time and a little more tea." As Lily hurried to fetch the kettle, Miss Marple's mind turned back to Willow Cottage, to the husband who grieved too, perfectly, and to the caretaker who watched from the shadows. The game, she knew, was far from over. Chapter 3. The caretaker's shadow. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village and lending an air of mystery to its quiet beauty. Willow Cottage, at the end of Lilac Lane, stood, half hidden behind its curtain of ivy, its silence louder than any clamour. The inquest had come and gone, leaving the village restless, its collective mind turning over the puzzle of Eleanor Trent's death. Miss Jane Marple, stepping lightly along the path to the church, her black handbag swinging gently, felt the weight of that puzzle as keenly as any. Her thoughts, however, were not on the late Mrs. Trent or her polished husband, but on the figure who lingered at the edges of the tragedy. Mr. Hodges, the caretaker. Hodges was a man who seemed to belong to the shadows. In the 6 months since his arrival at Willow Cottage, he had carved out a place in St. Mary Mead that was both indispensable and invisible. The gardens bloomed under his care, the hedges were trimmed with military precision, and the cottages, ancient plumbing, no longer groaned. Yet the man himself remained a cipher. His speech was sparse, his origins vague, and his presence, though constant, was as unobtrusive as the mist now curling around Miss Marple's ankles. She had seen him at the inquest, standing at the back, his eyes fixed on Charles Trent with an intensity that spoke of more than casual employment. It was this intensity, this unspoken thread between master and servant, that now drew her attention. Miss Marple paused at the church gate, ostensibly to adjust her scarf, but in truth to observe the village waking. From her vantage point, she could see the post office, where Miss Weatherby was already sorting letters with her usual vigour, and the grocer's, where Mr. Polk's delivery boy was unloading crates. Beyond, the lane to Willow Cottage wound out of sight, and there, just visible through the mist, was Hodges himself, a dark silhouette pushing a wheelbarrow toward the estate. His movements were deliberate, almost furtive, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A man who worked so early, she thought, might have much to hide or much to protect. Her morning's errands took her to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was arranging flowers for the altar. The vicarage parlour was warm, its windows steamed from the kettle, and Mrs. Clement's chatter was as bright as the chrysanthemums in her hands. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple," she said, snipping a stem. "Poor Eleanor Trent, taken. So young, and Mr. Trent left all alone. He was so kind at the harvest supper, bringing extra cider for the children. But I must say, that caretaker of theirs, Hodges, isn't it? Gives me the shivers. Always lurking, never smiling." Miss Marple, sipping tea, tilted her head. Lurking, you say? Has he been seen about the village much? Oh, now and then, Mrs. Clement replied, her scissors pausing. He comes to the shop for provisions, but he's not one for conversation. Last week I saw him at the chemist's, buying a bottle of tonic. Said it was for his nerves, but he looked fit enough to me. And then there's that business with the woods. Young Tom Sawyer, he's the gamekeeper's boys. Says he's seen Hodges slipping into the copse behind Willow Cottage at all hours. Poaching, Tom thinks, but I wonder. Miss Marple's cup paused halfway to her lips. Tonic for nerves, and nocturnal wanderings in the woods. These were details to be stored, like beads waiting to be strung. She recalled a case in St. Mary. Mead, years ago, a gardener who had used his nighttime rambles to cover darker deeds. People, she knew, often hid their true purposes in plain sight, and Hodges's reticence was a cloak she intended to lift. Thanking Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple continued her circuit, her steps taking her past Willow Cottage itself. The gate was ajar, and she hesitated, then slipped through. Her excuse a lost glove from a recent visit ready on her lips. The garden was immaculate, the roses pruned to perfection, but the air felt heavy, as if the cottage held its breath. As she approached the front door, Hodges emerged from the side path, a spade in hand. His eyes, shadowed beneath his cap, met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to still. "Good morning, Mr. Hodges," Miss Marple said, her voice as bright as her smile. "Such a fine day for gardening. I seem to have mislaid a glove, silly of me. Might I have a look inside?" Hodges's grip on the spade tightened, but his face remained impassive. "House is locked, ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough. "Mr. Trent's orders. I can look for your glove in the garden, if you like." "Oh, no trouble," Miss Marple said, waving a hand. "I'll ask Mr. Trent another time. You've done wonders with the roses, I see. Been with the Trents long, have you?" "6 months," Hodges replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Came from up north. Suits me here." Miss Marple nodded, her smile unwavering, but her mind was racing. 6 months. 6 months coinciding with the Trents settling into Willow Cottage, and up north was as vague as a winter fog. She thanked him and turned back to the lane, feeling his gaze on her until she rounded the bend. Hodges, she decided, was a man who guarded his secrets as fiercely as he guarded the cottage. Back in the village, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Bantry, whose manor house offered a commanding view of St. Mary Mead's comings and goings. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for intrigue, welcomed her with a tray of scones and a flood of gossip. "Jane, you're just in time," she said, pouring tea. "I've heard the most peculiar thing about that Hodges fellow. My gardener, old Fred, says he saw him burning something in the lodge's fireplace last night. Papers, Fred thinks, though it was too dark to be sure. And then there's the matter of his tools. Fred swears Hodges keeps a locked shed behind the lodge, and no one's allowed near it." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Burning papers, you say? How very curious. And a locked shed. Most gardeners are proud to show their tools. Has Fred seen anything else?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Only that Hodges is often out at dawn, long before the rest of the village stirs. Fred's up early himself, tending the greenhouses, and he's seen Hodges coming back from the woods, carrying a sack. Could be garden clippings, Fred says, but it looked heavy, like something else." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving a pattern. Papers burned, a locked shed, a sack in the woods. These were not the actions of an ordinary caretaker. She recalled Charles Trent's composure at the inquest, the way his eyes had sought Hodges, and now she wondered what bound these two men. Was Hodges a servant following orders, or a partner in some deeper scheme? Her next stop was the chemist's, a small shop redolent of lavender and liniment. Mr. Grayson, the chemist, was a precise man with a memory for his customers' habits. Miss Marple, inquiring after a remedy for rheumatism, steered the conversation. To Hodges. "I hear he bought tonic recently," she said, her tone casual. "For his nerves, was it?" Mr. Grayson nodded, polishing his spectacles. "Aye, a bottle of Fowler's solution, last week. Said he needed it for sleeplessness. I warned him to take it, sparingly. It's arsenic-based, you know, though safe in small doses. He paid in cash and left quick. Not a talkative sort." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face betrayed nothing. Fowler's solution arsenic, even in medicinal form, was a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. She thanked Mr. Grayson and stepped back into the street, her mind turning over the possibilities. Arsenic could be a tonic, yes, but it could also be a poison, slow and subtle, or swift if the dose was high. Eleanor Trent's heart failure, so sudden and unexplained, took on a darker hue. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting a pretext for thought. The village hummed around her, but her focus was on Hodges. She recalled a case in her youth. A groundskeeper who had used his access to a great house to smuggle stolen goods, his quiet demeanor a perfect disguise. Hodges's reticence, his odd hours, his connection to Charles Deas suggested a man with more than gardening on his mind. She thought of the woods, the sack, the locked shed. What did he hide, and why? Her reverie was broken by a visit from Inspector Slack, a brusque man whose opinion of amateur sleuths was low, but whose respect for Miss Marple had grown through past encounters. He settled into her parlour, his notebook open. "I hear you've been asking about the Trent case," he said, his tone half admiring, half exasperated. "The inquest's done, Miss Marple. Natural causes. No need to stir things up." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Stir, Inspector. I merely listen, but tell me, have you spoken to Mr. Hodges? He was at Willow Cottage when Mrs. Trent was found, was he not?" Slack frowned. "Aye, he was. Said he went to check the boiler at dawn, found the door ajar, and saw Mrs. Trent dead. Ran for the doctor, nothing more. His story holds, and Trent backs him. No evidence of foul play." "None at all?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild. "Not even a bottle of tonic or a sack in the woods?" Slack's eyes narrowed, but he closed his notebook. "You see too much, Miss Marple. I'll look into Hodges, but don't expect miracles. This isn't one of your village intrigues." As he left, Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Slack was competent, but he lacked imagination. She thought of Hodges's eyes, sharp and wary, and of the arsenic in his possession. She thought of Charles Trent, whose grief seemed a performance, and of the fortune that now passed to him. The threads were there, but the pattern was incomplete. That evening, as the village settled into twilight, Miss Marple took a final walk, her steps leading her past the woods behind Willow. Cottage. The air was cool, the trees whispering secrets. She paused at the edge of the copse, her eyes scanning the undergrowth. There, half hidden by brambles, was a patch of disturbed earth, as if something had been buried or unearthed. She made a mental note, her heart steady despite the chill. Hodges was a shadow. But shadows, Miss Marple knew, were cast by something solid. She would watch him, and through him, she would find the truth of Willow Cottage. As she turned back to her cottage, the first stars blinked above, and her mind was alight with possibilities. The game, she thought, was growing intricate, and she was ready to play her part. Chapter 4. A Visit to Willow Cottage. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village's cobbled lanes and thatched roofs. Willow Cottage, at the far end of Lilac Lane, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, its ivy-clad walls a mute witness to the tragedy within. The village had settled into an uneasy calm since the inquest, but the whispers persisted, curling like smoke around the names of Charles Trent and his enigmatic caretaker. Mr. Hodges, Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked into her capacious black bag, stepped out of her cottage with a determined air. Today she had a purpose: to see Willow Cottage for herself, to feel the pulse of the place where Eleanor Trent had met her end. The invitation had come from Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose insatiable curiosity was matched only by her knack for securing access to the village's most guarded corners. "Jane," she had said over tea the previous day, her eyes gleaming, "I've told Charles Trent we must call to offer our condolences. He can't very well refuse, not with the village watching. And you, with your sharp eyes, might spot something." "The rest of us, miss." Miss Marple had agreed, her smile as mild as her intentions were keen. A visit to Willow Cottage was precisely what she needed to test the threads of suspicion now weaving through her mind. The two women set out at mid-morning, Mrs. Bantry's brisk stride a contrast to Miss Marple's measured pace. The lane was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant bleat of sheep from the meadows beyond. As they approached the cottage, its isolation struck Miss Marple anew. Set apart from the village proper, with only the woods and the caretaker's lodge for company, Willow Cottage was a world unto itself, perfect stage for secrets. The gate creaked as Mrs. Bantry pushed it open, and they stepped into the garden, where the roses, still vibrant despite the season, bore testament to Hodges's skill. Charles Trent met them at the door, his dark suit sombre but impeccably tailored, his face a study in controlled grief. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and warm, "how kind of you to call. Please, come in." He ushered them into the drawing-room, a space of polished oak and chintz, where a fire crackled. In the grate, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and loss, and Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in every detail: the pristine upholstery, the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor on the mantel, the faint dust on a side table. That suggested a lapse in housekeeping. "May I offer you tea?" Charles asked, gesturing to a tray already set with a porcelain pot and delicate cups. His hands, Miss Marple noted, trembled slightly as he lifted the pot, a crack in the facade of his composure. She accepted a cup with a murmur of thanks, her gaze drifting to the window, where the garden lay in orderly splendour. Hodges was nowhere in sight, but she felt his presence, a shadow just beyond the frame. Mrs. Bantry, never one for prolonged silence, launched into condolences with her usual vigour. "Mr. Trent, we were so shocked to hear of dear Eleanor's passing, such a bright soul, taken far too soon. The village feels her loss keenly, I assure you." Her words were heartfelt, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple, signalling her readiness to probe. Charles inclined his head, his expression one of practiced sorrow. "Thank you, Mrs. Bantry. Eleanor was everything to me. Her health was fragile, but we hoped for many years together. This has been a blow I can scarcely comprehend." His voice caught, and he turned to the fire, as if to compose himself. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the set of his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened on the mantel. Grief, she knew, could be genuine or performed, and Charles Trent was a man who understood the art of performance. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a breeze, "if we might see Eleanor's room. I knew her only slightly, but I should like to pay my respects in some small way. A place where she spent her final hours. It feels fitting." Charles hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he recovered. "Of course," he said, rising. "It's just upstairs. I've left it as she liked it, though it's painful to enter." He led the way, his steps measured, and Miss Marple followed, her heart quickening. Mrs Bantry, sensing the moment's weight, kept pace, her chatter subdued. The staircase was narrow, its oak banister gleaming under recent polish. At the landing, Charles opened a door to a room that seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor's bedroom was a study in delicate taste. Pale blue curtains, a quilted bedspread, a dressing table adorned with silver-backed brushes. The air was cool, the window ajar, and Miss Marple's eyes swept the space with the precision of a hawk. The bed was made, its pillows plumped, but the room felt staged, as if arranged for an audience. On the bedside table stood a glass of water, untouched, and a small bottle of medicine, its label turned just out of view. "Her medicines?" Charles said, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Dr. Haydock prescribed them for her heart. She took them faithfully, though they did little in the end." His voice was steady, but his hand brushed the table, and Miss Marple caught a faint tremor. She stepped closer, her shawl brushing the carpet, and her eyes fell on a subtle irregularity, a faint, irregular stain, no larger than a shilling, half hidden by the table's edge. Before she could examine it, Charles moved, his foot sliding over the spot with casual precision. "The room is much as she left it," he said, his tone a shade too bright. "I find comfort in that." Miss Marple nodded, her smile bland, but her mind was alight. A stain, quickly concealed spilled medicine, perhaps, or something more sinister. She recalled Dr. Haydock's mention of a bitter scent, dismissed as medicinal, and her suspicions deepened. Arsenic, she knew, could be colourless, its traces easily overlooked unless one sought them. She turned to the dressing table, noting the absence of personal Clutino stray hairpins, no half-read novel. Eleanor's life, it seemed, had been tidied away with unnerving thoroughness. Mrs Bantry, less attuned to subtlety, broke the silence. "Such a lovely room, Mr. Trent. Eleanor had exquisite taste. Did she spend much time here, or was she often about the village?" Charles's smile was tight. She loved the garden when her strength allowed. Hodges was a great help. There she admired his work. Indoors she rested often. Her condition demanded it. He gestured toward the door, a polite hint that the visit was nearing its end. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her eyes catching a glint of metal beneath the better hairpin, perhaps, or something else. She made a mental note, her expression one of serene interest as they descended to the drawing room. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Hodges. His absence during their visit was conspicuous, yet his handiwork was everywhere: the polished floors, the pristine garden, the silent efficiency of the household. She recalled Mrs. Clement's tale of his nocturnal wanderings, Mr. Grayson's account of the arsenic tonic, and Mrs. Bantry's mention of burned papers. Hodges was a man who moved unseen. yet his presence loomed over Willow Cottage like a spectre. Charles, resuming his role as host, offered more tea, but Mrs Bantry, sensing the moment's close, declined with a flourish. "We mustn't keep. You, Mr Trent, you've been most kind. If there's anything the village can do, you've only to ask." Her words were warm, but her glance at Miss Marple was sharp, a silent query for observations. As they stepped into the garden, Miss Marple's eyes caught a movement at the edge of the lawn. Hodges, his cap pulled low, was pruning a rosebush with slow, deliberate strokes. His gaze lifted, meeting hers, and for a moment the air seemed to thicken. His eyes were not hostile, but guarded, as if measuring her intent. Miss Marple smiled, her nod as courteous as ever, but her heart noted the tension in his frame. The way his hand paused on the shears. Mrs Bantry, oblivious to the exchange, linked arms with Miss Marple as they passed through the gate. "Well, Jane, what did you make of it? Charles Trent is all charm, but there's something off, don't you think? And that room so perfect, it's unnatural. Like a stage set." Miss Marple's lips curved. "A stage set, Dolly, is an apt comparison. Mr Trent plays his part well, but every actor has a cue, and I wonder who provides his. As for the room, it tells a story, if one knows how to read it." She did not mention the stain, nor the glint beneath the bed, but tucked them away, like stitches in a complex pattern. The walk back to the village was brisk, the air sharp with the promise of evening. Mrs Bantry, her curiosity unsated, pressed for details. But Miss Marple was evasive, her responses as delicate as her lace collar. "Patience, Dolly," she said at last. "A puzzle takes time to assemble, and Willow Cottage has many pieces." Mrs Bantry sighed, but her trust in Miss Marple's instincts was absolute. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting a soft counterpoint to her thoughts. The visit had confirmed her suspicions. Charles Trent was a man under strain, his grief a carefully constructed facade. The stain on the carpet, the untouched glass, the medicine bottle, these were clues, small but significant, and Hodges, ever present yet unseen, was a key she had yet to turn. She recalled his eyes in the garden, wary and calculating, and wondered what role he played in the drama of Willow Cottage. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. Lily, her face flushed, announced a visitor, Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, clutching a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple," she said, settling into a chair, "I thought you should know. I was sorting the post this morning, and there was a letter for Willow Cottage, addressed to Eleanor, posted the day before she died, from London. I gave it to Mr Trent, but he looked queer when he saw it, stuffed it in his pocket without a word." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "A letter, you say? How very interesting. Did you catch the sender's name?" Miss Weatherby shook her head. "The writing was smudged, but it was a man's hand, I'd swear. Thick envelope, too, like it held more than a note. I thought it odd, her getting mail so soon before. Well, you know." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. A letter from London, posted before Eleanor's death, and Charles's reaction, another thread in the tapestry. She thought of the fortune Eleanor had brought to the marriage, the trust that passed to Charles upon her death. Wealth, she knew, was a motive that twisted even the most polished hearts, and Charles Trent's heart was a mystery she was determined to unravel as evening fell. Miss Marple took up her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet. Willow Cottage was a house of secrets, and today's visit had brought her closer to its truth. Charles Trent, with his trembling hands and hidden stains, was a man with something to conceal. Hodges, with his silent vigilance, was his shadow, bound to him by a tie she could not yet name. And Eleanor, poor Eleanor, had left clues in her tidy room, clues Miss Marple would follow to their end. The game, she thought, was growing intricate, and she was ready for its next move. Chapter 5. The Village Whispers. The days following Miss Marple's visit to Willow Cottage were marked by a subtle shift in St. Mary Mead's rhythm. The village, ever sensitive to its own undercurrents, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next revelation in the tragedy of Eleanor Trent. The autumn air grew sharper, the leaves carpeting the lanes in shades of amber and crimson, and the gossip, like the wind, found its way into every corner. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her neat parlour with her knitting spread across her lap, listened to the villagers' pulse through the reports of her maid, Lily, and the casual chatter of neighbours. Each snippet, each whispered suspicion, was a thread in the tapestry she was weaving, and she handled them with the care of a master weaver. Lily, ever eager to relay the latest, burst into the parlour that morning with a tray of scones and noose. "Miss Marple, the talk's all about Willow Cottage again," she said, setting the tray down with a clatter. "Mrs. Price was at the baker's, saying she's not been back to clean since Mrs. Trent died. Mr. Trent told her to stay away, said he'd manage with Hodges. And then there's Miss Hartnell, who swears she saw lights in the cottage windows late last night, flickering like someone was searching for something." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes bright behind. "Her spectacles. Lights, you say? How curious." And Mrs. Price dismissed most unusual for a house in mourning. "Did Miss Hartnell say anything else?" Lily nodded, her cheeks pink with excitement. "She did," Miss said. "She heard a row a few nights before Mrs. Trent passed, coming from the cottage. A woman's voice, sharp and angry, and a man's, low but fierce. She couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't a friendly chat, that's certain. Folk are wondering if it was Mrs. Trent and her husband, or maybe someone else." Miss Marple poured her tea, her mind turning over the new information. A quarrel, overheard in the night, was a significant detail, one that added depth to the puzzle of Eleanor's death. She recalled Charles Trent's polished grief, the faint stain in Eleanor's room, and Hodges's guarded eyes in the garden. A woman's voice, Eleanor's perhaps, or another's, raised in anger, suggested discord beneath the cottage's serene facade. And lights at night, after Charles's supposed solitude, hinted at activity he preferred to keep hidden. "Thank you, Lily," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "You've a knack for hearing what matters. I think I shall take a turn about the village today. The air will clear my thoughts." Lily beamed and bustled off, leaving Miss Marple to her reflections. The village whispers were more than gossip. They were the raw material of truth, unpolished but revealing. She thought of Eleanor's fortune, the trust that had passed to Charles. Upon her death, and of Hodges's purchase of Fowler's solution, the arsenic-based tonic. The quarrel, the lights, the dismissal of Mrs. Price, these were pieces of a larger whole, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. Her morning walk took her first to the post office, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was sorting letters with her usual precision. The shop was a hub of village life, its counter a stage for confidences, and Miss Marple, under the guise of buying stamps, steered the conversation to Willow Cottage. "Such a sad business, Miss Weatherby," she said, her tone sympathetic. "I hear Mr. Trent is managing alone now, with only Hodges to help. It must be a lonely time." Miss Weatherby's pince-nez glinted as she leaned forward. "Lonely, perhaps," but he's keeping busy. I saw him yesterday, posting another letter to London, same thick envelope as before, addressed to some firm. He looked distracted, not his usual charming self. And Hodges was with him again, carrying a package wrapped in oilcloth. I don't trust that man, Miss Marple. His eyes are too sharp, like he's always watching. Miss Marple nodded, tucking the detail away. Another letter to London, and Hodges's presence. These echoed the postmistress's earlier account, suggesting a pattern. She thanked Miss Weatherby and moved on to the grocer's, where Mr. Pock, the constable's brother, was stacking tins of biscuits. His talk was less guarded, his opinions freely given. "Trent's a fine gentleman," he said, wiping his hands on his apron, "but I'll tell you what, Miss Marple, that caretaker of his, is a queer one. Came in last week for a tin of paraffin, said it was for the lodger's lamps. But who needs paraffin in such quantity? And he paid with a crisp pound notad for a working man. Paraffin, Miss Marple thought, could light lamps or destroy evidence. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's tale of Hodges burning papers in the lodge's fireplace, and a new possibility took shape. "Did he say anything else, Mr. Poke?" she asked, her voice as gentle as her smile. "Not much," Poke replied, "but he was in a hurry, kept looking over his shoulder. I saw him later, heading toward the woods with that sack of his. Gamekeeper's boy says he's always in there, digging or hiding something. Makes you wonder what he's up to." Miss Marple thanked him and continued her circuit, her steps taking her past the churchyard, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, was tending a rosebush. His gentle demeanour belied a keen observer's mind, and Miss Marple paused to exchange pleasantries. "The village is troubled, Mr. Clement," she said, her eyes on the gravestones. "Mrs. Trent's death has left questions, has it not?" The vicar sighed, his shears pausing. "Indeed, Miss Marple. Eleanor was a generous soul, always ready with a donation for the poor fund. I saw her last at the harvest supper, looking tired but cheerful. Her death was a shock, and the talk now is unsettling. Some say Mr. Trent stands to gain a fortune, and others whisper of that caretaker's odd ways. I try not to judge, but the heart grieves for truth." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A fortune, confirmed by the vicar's quiet words, was a motive that loomed large. She thought of Charles's trembling hands, Hodges's nocturnal wanderings, and the angry voices overheard by Miss Hartnell. "Truth, Mr. Clement," she said softly, "is often hidden in the smallest details. We must keep our eyes open." Her next stop was the tea shop, a cosy nook where the villagers' women gathered to dissect its dramas. Mrs. Hartnell, a formidable matron with a voice that carried, held court at a corner table, her companions hanging on her words. Miss Marple, ordering a pot of Darjeeling, joined them with a smile, her presence as unassuming as her shawl. "I hear you've had a view of Willow Cottage, Mrs. Hartnell," she said, stirring her tea. "Lights at night, and voices before the tragedy most intriguing." Mrs. Hartnell's eyes gleamed, her moment of importance seized. "I should say so, Miss Marple. I was walking my dog, Rufus, 3 nights before poor Mrs. Trent died, and I heard it clear as day, a woman shouting, full of fire, and a man answering, low and sharp. It came from the cottage, no mistake. I couldn't see who it was, but it wasn't a happy house that night. And then, 2 nights ago, I saw lights moving in the upstairs windows, like someone with a candle, searching. Mr. Trent was supposed to be alone, so who was it?" Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. A quarrel, lights, and now a fortune. The pieces were mounting. each one sharpening the image of Willow Cottage as a place of secrets. She thanked Mrs. Hartnell and her companions, her mind cataloguing their words. As she left the tea shop, she passed the chemist's, where a sudden impulse led her inside. Mr. Grayson, polishing his counter, greeted her with a nod. "Back so soon, Miss Marple. More rheumatism troubles?" "Oh, just a small matter," she said, her tone light. "I was thinking of that tonic Mr. Hodges bought Fowler's solution, was it? You mentioned it's arsenic-based. Is it common for such a purchase?" Mr. Grayson frowned, his cloth pausing. "Not common, no. It's old-fashioned, used for nerves or skin complaints, but it's tricky stuff. I told Hodges to measure it carefully, 1 drop too many, and it's dangerous. He seemed to know what he was about, though said he'd used it before, up north." Miss Marple's smile was bland, but her thoughts raced. Arsenic, known to Hodges from his past, and a quarrel in the night, these were not coincidences but clues. She thanked Mr. Grayson and stepped back into the street, her mind weaving the villagers' whispers into a pattern. Charles Trent, with his fortunes secured, had motive. Hodges, with his tonic and his secrets, had means. And Eleanor, caught between them, had paid the price. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, the sun warm on her shoulders, her knitting a pretext for thought. The village had given her much. A quarrel, lights, paraffin, a letter, a sack in the woods. She thought of Eleanor, vibrant at the harvest supper, and of the trust that had bound her wealth to her husband. She thought of Hodges, his sharp eyes, and locked shed, and of Charles, whose grief seemed a mask. The whispers were clear, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the shadows of Willow Cottage. Her reverie was broken by a visit from Mrs. Bantry, who arrived with a basket of apples, and a fresh wave of gossip. "Jane, you'll never guess," she said, settling onto a garden chair. "My maid, Elsie, heard from the milkman that Mr. Trent's been asking about selling Willow Cottage, so soon after Eleanor's death, and Hodges was seen at the station, buying a ticket to London, though he didn't board the train. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I make, Dolly, that we are dealing with men in a hurry to sell, a hurry to leave, a hurry to hide. But haste, as you know, often betrays." She did not mention the arsenic, nor the quarrel, but tucked Mrs. Bantry's news away, another thread in her tapestry, as evening fell. Miss Marple took up her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet. The village whispers had given her a map, incomplete but illuminating. Charles Trent, with his letters and his fortune, was a man with plans. Hodges, with his tonic and his shadows, was his accomplice, willing or coerced. And Eleanor, her voice raised in anger, had known something that cost her life. Miss Marple's heart was heavy, but her resolve was firm. The truth, she knew, was close, and she would follow the whispers to its heart. Chapter 6. The doctors doubt the autumn days in St. Mary Mead had taken on a brittle edge, the mornings crisp with frost, and the evenings heavy with the scent of wood smoke. Willow Cottage, its windows now perpetually dark, stood as a silent sentinel at the edge of the village, its secrets locked within its ivy-clad walls. The whispers of Eleanor Trent's death had not faded, but grown sharper, honed by the village's relentless curiosity and Miss Jane Marple's quiet probing. She sat now in her parlour, her knitting a soft rhythm against the ticking of the clock, her mind sifting through the fragments she had gathered. Charles Trent's polished grief, Hodges's arsenic tonic, the quarrel overheard in the night, and the faint stain in Eleanor's room. Each was a piece of the puzzle, But the picture remained incomplete, and Miss Marple knew that truth often lay in the doubts of those closest to the scene. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was a man whose doubts carried weight. A friend of long standing, he had a mind as precise as his stethoscope, and an instinct for the anomalies that lurked beneath the surface of illness. It was no surprise then, when he called on Miss Marple that afternoon, his face etched with unease. The invitation had been casual, a request for tea and a chat, but Miss Marple, sensing purpose in his step, had prepared her parlour with care, the fire bright and the teapot steaming. As he settled into an armchair, his coat draped over the back, she noted the furrow in his brow, the way his fingers tapped the armrest. This, she thought, was a man wrestling with a question he could not yet name. "Jane," he began, accepting a cup with a nod, "I've been turning over Eleanor. Trent's death, and I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. The inquest settled it as heart failure, and I signed the certificate myself, but it sits ill with me. I thought you, with your knack for seeing what others miss, might have a thought or two." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but her voice was grave. "A doctor's doubt is a powerful thing, Dr. Haydock. Tell me what troubles you. Was there something in Mrs. Trent's condition that seemed out of place?" Haydock leaned forward, his tea forgotten. "That's just it. Eleanor was young 20th, with a heart murmur noted in her girlhood, but nothing to suggest imminent collapse. I saw her a month ago for a routine check, and she was tired, yes, but lively. She spoke of plans for a winter trip, laughed about the vicar's sermon. No shortness of breath, no fainting spells, and yet she was found dead, with no sign of struggle, no warning." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, would have clicked faster had she been knitting. A healthy young woman, dead without prelude. This was no ordinary case of heart failure. She recalled the medicine bottle in Eleanor's room, the untouched glass, and Charles's quick step to cover the stain. "You examined her, of course," she said, her tone gentle. "Was there anything unusual, anything at all?" Haydock's frown deepened. "I noted a faint, bitter scent in the room, like almonds, but I put it down to her medicines. She was taking a digitalis preparation for her heart, and I assumed it was that. But now, I wonder." "There was no autopsy," Charles was adamant, said. Eleanor had dreaded the thought, and I saw no cause to insist. The inquest was quick, and I let it pass, but that scent, it's been nagging at me." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. A bitter, almond-like scent was no stranger to her reading. It was the hallmark of cyanide, a poison swift and merciless. She thought of Hodges's purchase of Fowler's solution, an arsenic-based tonic, and wondered if another poison might have been procured, its traces masked by the chaos of grief. "Cyanide," she murmured, almost to herself, "is a curious thing. It mimics heart failure, does it not? And leaves little trace unless one seeks it." Haydock's eyes widened. "Cyanide, good heavens, Jane, that's a leap. But, yes, it could present as heart failure, especially in a young woman with a known condition. The symptoms, sudden collapse, no visible trauma fit. But there was no bottle, no residue, nothing to suggest it. And who would administer such a thing?" Charles was in London, and Hodges, though odd, is hardly a chemist. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. "Who, indeed? Tell me, Dr. Haydock, what was your impression of Mr. Trent when you saw him, and of Hodges, who was so quick to fetch you?" Haydock rubbed his chin, his gaze distant. Charles was distraught, or seemed so. He arrived from London just after I'd examined Eleanor, pale as a ghost, his hands shaking. He asked questions how she died, if she suffered, but his eyes kept darting to Hodges, who was hovering by the door. Hodges was efficient. Too efficient, perhaps. He'd already tidied the room, moved the medicine bottle, even offered to arrange the funeral. I thought it odd, a caretaker taking such initiative, but Charles seemed grateful. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Tidying a room, moving a bottle, these were actions that could preserve a scene or obscure it. She recalled Mrs. Hartnell's account of a quarrel, the lights flickering in the cottage at night, and Miss Weatherby's mention of Charles's letters to London. Hodges's efficiency, she suspected, was less about duty than design. And the medicine bottle, she said, her voice soft. Did you examine it closely? Haydock shook his head. It was digitalis, as prescribed. I checked the label, saw nothing amiss. But if there was another substance, well, I didn't test for it. The glass of water on the table was clean, untouched. I assumed she'd taken her dose and gone to bed. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts weaving a pattern. An untouched glass suggested no medicine had been taken, nor that it had been replaced. She thought of the stain Charles had covered, the glint beneath the bed she had glimpsed during her visit, a dropped vial, perhaps, or a spilled drop of something more sinister. You've given me much to ponder, Dr. Haydock, she said, her smile warm. A doctor's doubt is like a pebble in a pond the ripples spread far. Haydock rose, his expression lighter but still troubled. You'll keep this between us, Jane. I've no proof, only a feeling, and I'd hate to stir trouble without— Of course, Miss Marple said, her eyes kind but keen. But feelings, Dr. Haydock, are often the first step to truth. As he left, Miss Marple took up her knitting, her needles a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Cyanide, with its bitter scent, was a bold choice for murder, requiring access and nerve. Charles, absent in London, seemed an unlikely hand, but Hodges, with his quiet presence and chemical knowledge, was another matter. She recalled Mr. Grayson's account of the arsenic tonic, Hodges's claim of prior use up north. Arsenic was slow, cyanide swift. Could a man versed in one poison know another? And what of Charles, whose fortune now swelled with Eleanor's death? The doctor's doubt had sharpened her focus, and she resolved to probe deeper. Her afternoon was spent in the village, her errands a pretext for gathering more whispers. At the baker's, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, spoke of Eleanor's last visit to the church, her hands trembling as she arranged hymnals. She seemed preoccupied. Mrs. Clement said, as if something weighed on her. I asked if she was well, and she smiled, but her eyes were distant. I wonder now if she sensed trouble. Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. A preoccupied woman, days before her death, suggested fear or suspicion. She moved on to the Groceries, where Mr. Polk's wife, a woman with a nose for scandal, offered a new tidbit. I saw Hodges at the market yesterday, buying a bottle of cleaning fluid strong stuff, for stains, he said. Odd, with Mrs. Price gone and the cottage shut up. What's he cleaning, I wonder? Cleaning fluid, Miss Marple thought, could erase more than dirt. She recalled the stain in Eleanor's room, Charles's foot so quick to cover it. Had Hodges been tasked with removing evidence, or was he acting alone? She thanked Mrs. Pork and continued to the tea shop, where a cluster of women, led by Miss Hartnell, dissected the latest rumours. Miss Marple joining them with a pot of Earl Grey, steered the talk to Hodges. "I hear he's been busy at the cottage," she said, her tone idle. "Cleaning, perhaps, or tending to Mr. Trent's needs." Miss Hartnell snorted. "Busy, yes, but not with honest work. My nephew saw him in the woods again, carrying that sack of his, and this time it was dusk, not dawn. He was headed toward the old quarry, where no one goes. If you ask me, he's hiding something, stolen goods, maybe, or worse." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her smile was bland. The quarry, a forgotten pit beyond the woods, was a place for secrets. She thought of Hodges's locked shed, the paraffin, the burned papers. A man who hid in quarries and cleaned stains was no mere caretaker. She thanked the women and left, her mind alight with possibilities. That evening, Miss Marple called on Mrs Bantry, whose manor house was a trove of village lore. Mrs Bantry, delighted by the visit, poured sherry and shared her latest findings. "Jane, you'll be interested in this," she said, her eyes sparkling. "My cook heard from the milkman that Charles Trent's been asking about a solicitor in Dannymouth, someone to handle Eleanor's estate, and Hodges was seen at the cottage. Yesterday, scrubbing the upstairs floor. Mrs Price's sister passed by and saw him through the window. What's he scrubbing, I wonder?" Miss Marple's lips curved. A solicitor and a scrubbing caretaker, most suggestive. Dolly. A man who plans his future and erases his past is a man with much to conceal. She did not mention cyanide, nor the quarry, but tucked Mrs Bantry's news into her growing. As she walked home under a starlit sky, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Eleanor. A woman trembling at church, angry in the night, dead by morning. She had known danger. Miss Marple was certain. The doctor's doubt had given her a lens, cyanide a possibility, and Hodges a focus. Charles, with his fortune and his letters, was the architect, but Hodges, with his poisons and his shadows, was the hand. The village whispers, the doctor's unease, the cottage's secrets, these were her map, and she would follow it to the truth. In her parlour, Miss Marple took up her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet. The doctor's doubt had opened a door, and she stepped through, her resolve as steady as her stitches. Willow Cottage was a house of lies, and she would unravel them, one thread at a time. The game, she thought, was nearing its climax, and she was ready to play her part. Chapter 7. The caretakers, past the frost of late autumn, had settled over St. Mary Mead, silvering the hedgerows and lending a crystalline clarity to the morning air. Willow Cottage, its chimneys smokeless and its windows blank, stood as a monument to the village's unease, its silence louder than any clamour. The whispers surrounding Eleanor Trent's death had grown into a low hum, fueled by the village's insatiable curiosity and Miss Jane Marple's quiet, relentless inquiries. She sat now in her parlour, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the crackle of the fire, her mind turning over the threads she had gathered. Charles Trent's calculated grief, Hodges's arsenic tonic, the bitter scent of cyanide, and the flickering lights in the cottage at night. Each clue pointed to a deeper truth, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that the key to unlocking Willow Cottage's secrets lay in the past, specifically the past of Mr. Hodges, the caretaker whose shadow loomed ever larger. Hodges was a man who seemed to exist on the margins, his presence as unobtrusive as the mist that clung to Lilac Lane. Yet his actions, buying paraffin, scrubbing stains, slipping into the woods, with a sack, suggested a purpose far beyond the duties of a gardener. Miss Marple, recalling Dr. Haydock's doubt and the villagers' tales of Hodges's oddities, resolved to probe deeper. A man's past, she knew, was a map to his present, and Hodges's history, shrouded in vagueness, was a map she intended to read. Her first step was to enlist the aid of her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with a knack for ferreting out information, and a network of contacts that spanned beyond the village. Raymond, visiting for the weekend, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with his usual flourish, his scarf trailing and his eyes bright with curiosity. Over tea, she outlined her request with her customary precision. Her tone, as mild as her purpose, was sharp. "Raymond, dear, I need you to look into a man named Hodges, the caretaker at Willow Cottage. He claims to have come from up north, but his references are vague, and his manner suggests a history he prefers to keep hidden. Could you make discreet inquiries? A man's past often explains his present." Raymond, ever eager for a challenge, grinned. "A mystery, Aunt Jane. You've got my attention. I'll wire a friend in London who knows people in the North Estate, managers, solicitors, the sort who keep records. If this Hodges has a past, I'll find it. Any particulars to guide me?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "He's wiry, perhaps 50, with a guarded manner. He's skilled with gardens, but knows chemicals, arsenic tonic, for one, and possibly more. He's been seen burning papers and frequenting the woods, and he was at the cottage when Mrs. Trent died. Look for any trouble dismissals, scandals, anything that might explain his reticence." Raymond jotted notes, his pen swift. "Sounds like a character from one of my novels. I'll have something for you in a day or two. Meanwhile, any theories? You're never without one." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Theories, Raymond, are like stitches. They must wait for the pattern to emerge. But I suspect Mr. Hodges is more than a caretaker, and his connection to Mr. Trent is more than employment. Hurry, dear, and be discreet." Raymond departed, promising swift results. And Miss Marple turned her attention to the village, where the whispers continued to swirl. Her morning walk took her to the churchyard, where she paused to chat with old Fred, Mrs. Bantry's gardener, whose memory for village newcomers was as sharp as his pruning shears. Fred, leaning on his rake, was eager to share. "That Hodges," he said, spitting into the grass. "He's a queer one, Miss Marple. Been here 6 months, but he don't mix. I asked him once where he trained gardens like his don't come by chance, and he said Yorkshire, then clammed up. Yorkshire's a big place, I told him, but he just walked off." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the distant outline of Willow Cottage. "Yorkshire, you say? Did he mention an estate or a family he served?" Fred scratched his chin. "Not by name, but he let slip he worked for a grand house till there was trouble. Didn't say what, but I reckon he was sacked. Had that look about him man who's bend down and don't trust easy. I seen it before, in my army days. Trouble in Yorkshire, this was a thread worth pulling." Miss Marple thanked Fred and continued to the post office, where Miss Weatherby, ever vigilant, provided another piece. "Hodges was in yesterday," she said, her pince-nez glinting. "Bought a single stamp for a letter to Leeds. Didn't say who it was for, but he was nervous, kept checking the door. I thought it odd, him writing at all he's not the letter sort." A letter to Leeds, Miss Marple thought, could mean a connection to his past or a warning to someone in it. She thanked Miss Weatherby and moved on to the tea shop, where Mrs. Hartnell and her coterie were dissecting the latest village drama. Miss Marple, joining them with a pot of chamomile, steered the talk to Hodges. "I hear he's been writing." "Letters," she said, her tone idle. A man so quiet must have little to say, unless it's two old friends. Mrs. Hartnell's eyes narrowed. Friends, is it? I doubt that man has any. My cousin in Yorkshire visits here sometimes, said. She heard of a gardener up there, years back, who was mixed up in a theft. Big estate, silver gone missing, and the man vanished before the police could pin him. Sounded like Hodges to me, though I've no proof. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained bland. Theft in Yorkshire. A gardener dismissed this. Echoed Fred's tale and gave Raymond's task new urgency. She thanked the women and left, her mind weaving the village's scraps into a pattern. Hodges's past was taking shape, and it was not one of honest labour by evening. Raymond's telegram arrived, terse but promising, found record of a John Hodges, gardener, dismissed from Blackthorn Hall, Yorkshire, 1920, theft suspected. No charges. Checking further. Miss Marple, reading it by the fire, felt a thrill of progress. Blackthorn Hall was a name, a place to anchor her suspicions. She wrote to Raymond, urging him to dig deeper employment records, local gossip, anything that might reveal Hodges's character or connections. The next day, Miss Marple's inquiries took her to the edge of the woods, where the gamekeeper's boy, Tom Sawyer, was stacking firewood. Tom, a sharp lad with a penchant for spying, was eager to talk. "I seen Hodges again, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes wide. "Last night, near the quarry, digging with a spade. He didn't see my was hid in the brambles, but he buried something, a box maybe, and covered it quick. Looked scared, he did." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A box buried in the quarry, this was no gardener's task. She thought of the burned papers, the paraffin, the cleaning fluid. Hodges was erasing his tracks, but why? And what linked him to Charles, whose fortune now swelled with Eleanor's death? "You're a clever boy, Tom," she said, slipping him a shilling. "Keep your eyes open, but stay safe." Her next stop was the chemist's, where Mr. Grayson, polishing his bottles, confirmed Hodges's recent purchase. "Came in 2 days ago," he said, "for more cleaning fluid, same strong stuff. Said he had a stubborn stain in the lodge. I thought it odd, him cleaning so much with the cottage shut up. He paid quick and left, no chat." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the stain in Eleanor's room. Charles's foot, so swift to cover it. Cleaning fluid, a buried box, a letter to Leeds's were the actions of a man with secrets to protect. She thanked Mr. Grayson and stepped into the street, her thoughts racing. Hodges's past, she suspected, held the key to his role in Eleanor's death, and Charles's role in turn. That afternoon, a second message from Raymond arrived, this one more detailed. John Hodges, employed at Blackthorn Hall, Yorkshire, 1918, 1920, suspected in theft of silver and cash, dismissed without proof. Locals recall him as solitary, skilled with plants but versed in chemicals from a state's greenhouse. Rumoured to have worked with apothecary after dismissal, handling poisons. No record since 1921. Miss Marple, reading by her window, felt the pattern tighten. A thief, a chemist, a man who vanished. Hodges's past was a mirror to his present, and his knowledge of poisons was no mere coincidence. She recalled Dr. Haydock's mention of cyanide, its bitter scent in Eleanor's room. Arsenic was Hodges's known tool, but cyanide, swifter and surer, could be within his reach, especially for a man who had worked with an apothecary. She thought of Charles, absent in London but quick to defend Hodges, and of the fortune that bound them? Was Hodges a pawn, coerced by a master, or a partner, driven by greed? The quarrel overheard by Mrs. Hartnell, the lights in the cottage. The buried box, these suggested a plan, and Hodges was its executor. Her evening was spent with Mrs. Bantry, whose manor house buzzed with fresh gossip. Over sherry, Mrs. Bantry shared a new tidbit. Jane, my maid, heard from the butcher that Hodges was seen at the cottage this morning, carrying a crate to the cellar. Heavy, she said, and he locked the door after. And Charles has been asking about shipping firm, says he's sending furniture to London, but so soon after Eleanor's death. It's fishy, if you ask me. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. Fishy, indeed, Dolly. A crate, a locked cellar. And shipping plans, Mr. Trent and his caretaker are busy men. But busy with what, I wonder? She did not mention Blackthorn Hall, nor the apothecary, but tucked Mrs. Bantry's news into her store. As she walked home under a moonlit sky, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Eleanor, a woman angry in the night, trembling at church, dead. By dawn she had crossed a dangerous path, one paved by her husband's ambition and her caretaker's past. Hodges, with his thief's history and poisoner's knowledge, was no mere servant, and Charles, with his letters and his wealth, was no mere widower. The villagers' whispers, Raymond's findings, the doctor's doubt, these were her tools, and she wielded them with precision. In her parlour, Miss Marple took up her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet. Hodges's past had given her a lens, cyanide a method, and Charles a motive. Willow Cottage was a house of shadows, and she was drawing closer to its heart. The game, she thought, was reaching its turning point, and she was ready to meet it. Chapter 8. The hidden letter. The late autumn chill had tightened its grip on St. Mary Mead, frosting the cobblestones and painting the village in hues of silver and shadow. Willow Cottage, at the end of Lilac Lane, stood as a silent enigma, its darkened windows reflecting the village's growing unease. The death of Eleanor Trent, once a shock, had become a riddle, its pieces scattered across the whispers of the village and the quiet deductions of Miss Jane Marple. She sat now in her parlour, her knitting a delicate counterpoint to the fire's crackle, her mind weaving together the threads she had gathered. Charles Trent's calculated charm, Hodges's shadowed past, the bitter scent of cyanide, and the buried box in the quarry. Each clue brought her closer to the truth. But Miss Marple knew that the heart of the mystery lay in what Eleanor herself might have left behind a trace. A warning, a cry from beyond the grave. The village, ever a crucible of gossip, had provided much, but Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Eleanor's final days. A woman trembling at church, angry in the night. Dead by dawn she had known danger, and Miss Marple suspected she had tried to name it. The idea of a letter, unposted or hidden, had taken root in her mind. Spurred by Miss Weatherby's mention of Charles's nervous handling of a London envelope, if Eleanor had written something, a note to a friend, a plea to her solicitor, could be the key to unlocking Willow Cottage's secrets. Miss Marple resolved to find it, and the village fate, with its bustle and loosened tongues, offered the perfect opportunity. The fete, held in the meadow behind the vicarage, was a riot of colour and sound. Stalls draped in bunting offered jams, knitted scarves, and homemade cider, while children darted through the crowd, their laughter mingling with the strains of a fiddle. Miss Marple, her shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders, moved through the throng with her usual unobtrusive grace, her eyes sharp for any hint of Willow Cottage's drama. She paused at Mrs. Clement's flower stall, complimenting the chrysanthemums while steering the talk to Eleanor. "Such a loss," she said, her tone soft. "I hear she was fond of writing letters, keeping up with old friends. Did she ever mention any to you?" Mrs. Clement, arranging a bouquet, shook her head. "Not to me, Miss Marple, but she was private about such things. I do recall her at the post office once, asking about express delivery, as if she needed something. Sent quickly. That was a week before she died, poor soul." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her smile was bland. Express delivery suggested urgency, a message Eleanor had wanted to reach its destination. She thanked Mrs. Clement and moved on, her steps taking her to the tea tent, where the village's women gathered like bees to a hive. There, amid the clink of cups and the hum of gossip, she found Elsie, the young maid from Willow Cottage, who had served under Mrs. Price. Elsie, her apron starched and her cheeks flushed from the fate's excitement, was chatting with a friend, and Miss Marple, joining them with a cup of Darjeeling, turned the conversation with her gentle skill. "Elsie, dear," she said, her voice warm, "you must miss working at Willow Cottage. Mrs. Trent was so kind, I hear. Did she ever ask you to post letters for her? I imagine she had many correspondents." Elsie's eyes widened, her spoon pausing in her tea. "Oh yes, miss, she did write letters, though not many. There was one, just before she died, that she gave me to post. I forgot till now she handed it to me in the hall, said it was for her solicitor in Dannymoth. But I got sick that day, and Mrs. Price took over, so I left it on the kitchen table. I don't know if it was sent, miss, and I daren't ask Mr. Trent." Miss Marple's heart leaped, but her face betrayed nothing. A letter to a solicitor. Unposted, this was the clue she had sought. "How thoughtful of you to remember, Elsie," she said, patting the girl's hand. "It may be important. Could you check the kitchen, perhaps, when you're next at the cottage?" Quietly, of course no need to trouble Mr. Trent. Elsie nodded, her expression earnest. "I'm going tomorrow to fetch my shawl. I left it in the scullery. I'll look, miss, and let you know. It's only right for Mrs. Trent's sake." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. A letter to a solicitor, left on a kitchen table, could hold Eleanor's fears, her suspicions, her truth. She moved through the fate with renewed purpose, her eyes scanning for Charles or Hodges, but neither appeared. The caretaker's absence was telling. Hodges, with his quarry burials and chemical knowledge, was a man who avoided crowds, and Charles, perhaps, was guarding his own secrets. She paused at the raffle stall, where Miss Hartnell was selling tickets with her usual vigour, and probed gently. "No sign of Mr. Trent today," she said, selecting a ticket. "Nor Hodges. I suppose they're keeping to themselves." Miss Hartnell snorted. "Keeping to themselves, or up to no good?" "My nephew saw Hodges again, near the quarry, carrying a spade at dusk. And Mr. Trent was at the station this morning, asking about trains to London, though he didn't buy a ticket. Planning to bolt, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, filing the details away. Hodges in the quarry, Charles at the station there. Movements suggested haste, a need to cover tracks or prepare an escape. She thanked Miss Hartnell and continued her circuit, her thoughts on Elsie's promise. The letter, if it existed, could change everything, and she resolved to guide the maid with care. The next morning, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting. A pretext for thought, when Elsie appeared at the gate, her face pale but determined. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "I found the letter. It was in the kitchen, tucked behind a tin of flour, like someone hid it. I didn't tell Mr. Trent, nor Hodges. They were both at the lodge when I went. Here it is, Miss. She handed over a creased envelope, its edges smudged but intact, addressed to Mr. Harold Grayson, solicitor, Danamouth, in Eleanor's elegant hand. Miss Marple's heart pounded, but her voice was calm. You've done well, Elsie. This may help us understand Mrs. Trent's wishes. I'll see it reaches the right hands. Say nothing for now, dear, it's safest. Elsie nodded and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to examine her prize. The envelope was sealed, its weight suggesting a single sheet, and the handwriting bore faint tremors, as if written in haste or fear. She hesitated, knowing the letter was not hers to open, but the urgency of the case pressed her forward. With a small knife, she slit the envelope, her hand steady, and unfolded the paper within. The message was brief, its words stark. Dear Mr. Grayson, I write in confidence, fearing for my safety. Charles is not what he seems, his plans are hidden, and I suspect the caretaker, Hodges, is his ally. If anything happens to me, look to them, and to the wealth that drives them. I beg you act swiftly. Yours, Eleanor Trent. Miss Marple's breath caught, her eyes tracing the shaky signature, the smudged ink where a tear might have fallen. Eleanor had known her danger, had named her fears, and had tried to warn the world. The letter was a beacon, illuminating Charles's motive and Hodges's complicity. She thought of the cyanide scent, the buried box, the cleaned stains, now bore the weight of Eleanor's words. But the letter, unposted, had not reached its destination, and Miss Marple wondered who had hidden it, and why. Her first instinct was to take the letter to Inspector Slack, but she paused, knowing his skepticism might delay action. Instead, she tucked it into her writing desk, her mind racing. The letter confirmed her suspicions, but it was not proof, only a guide to where proof might lie. She needed to watch Charles and Hodges, to catch them in a misstep, and the village, with its ever-watchful eyes, would be her ally. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Bantry, whose manor house was a nexus of village news. Over tea, she shared a carefully edited version of her findings, omitting the letter but probing for updates. Dolly, she said, stirring her cup, I hear Mr. Trent is planning for London, and Hodges is busy in the quarry. The cottage seems a hive of activity, does it not? Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed. A hive, indeed, Jane. My gardener saw Hodges yesterday, carrying a crate from the cellar to the lodge heavy, he said, and locked tight. And Charles was at the bank in Danamouth, asking about transferring funds abroad. Abroad, Jane. If that's not suspicious, I don't know what is. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the crate, the funds, the letter. Charles was preparing to flee, and Hodges was his hand, clearing the way. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and returned home, her mind turning to the quarry. Tom Sawyer's report of Hodges's digging suggested a hiding place, perhaps for evidence too. Dangerous to keep in the cottage. She resolved to investigate, but cautiously Hodges was no fool, and Charles was desperate. The next day, Miss Marple enlisted Tom, the gamekeeper's boy, with a shilling and a promise of secrecy. Tom, she said, meeting him by the churchyard, I need you to watch the quarry, but from a distance. Note what Hodges does, where he goes, but don't be seen. Report to me tomorrow, and keep your wits about you. Tom, thrilled by the task, nodded and vanished into the lanes. Miss Marple, returning to her cottage, spent the evening poring over Eleanor's letter, its words a silent plea. She thought of Charles's trembling hands, Hodges's chemical past, and the fortune that bound them. The letter was her trump card, but she needed more: a trace of cyanide, a witness to their plans, a crack in their facade. That night, as the village slept, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting idle. The letter had given her Eleanor's voice, and she would not let it fade. Charles and Hodges were moving swiftly, but she was swifter, her mind a net closing around them. The quarry, the crate, the funsies were her next steps, and she would follow them with the patience of a spider. The game, she thought, was nearing its endgame, and she was ready to play her hand. Chapter 9. The confrontation. The frost of late autumn had deepened in St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a crystalline hush that seemed to sharpen every sound and suspicion. Willow Cottage, its silhouette stark against the twilight, stood as a monument to secrets, its darkened windows reflecting the villagers' restless curiosity. The discovery of Eleanor Trent's letter, hidden and unposted, had ignited Miss Jane Marple's resolve. Its words a clarion call from a woman who had sensed her doom. The letter named Charles, Trent, and Hodges as threats, tying them to the wealth that now flowed to Charles's hands, and Miss Marple, with her quiet tenacity, knew the time had come to act. Her parlour, warmed by a low fire, was her war room, her knitting a pretext for the intricate strategy now forming in her mind. The thread cyanides, bitter scent, Hodges's quarry burials, Charles's London plans were converging, and she resolved to draw the men into the open, to test their masks with a carefully staged confrontation. The village, ever a mirror of its own dramas, buzzed with fresh rumours, and Miss Marple, sifting through them, saw an opportunity. The letter, though powerful, was not proof. It was a spur to provoke a reaction, to catch Charles and Hodges off guard. She needed them to betray themselves, to reveal the cracks in their carefully constructed facade. Her plan was simple but bold. She would invite them to tea under the guise of dispelling village gossip, then wield Eleanor's letter like a scalpel, probing their responses for guilt or fear. The setting her own cottage, with its cosy familiarity, would disarm them, and her questions, cloaked in innocence, would strike deep. She began by enlisting Mrs Bantry, whose social clout ensured the invitation would not be refused. Dolly. Miss Marple said over tea at the manor house, her voice as gentle as her purpose was firm. I need your help to host a small gathering. Mr Trent and Mr Hodges must come, to clear the air. You understand, the village is full of talk-lights in the cottage. Hodges's quarry visits, Charles's travel plans. A friendly chat, with you and I, might set things right. Mrs Bantry's eyes sparkled with intrigue. Jane, you sly thing, you're up to something, I can tell. Of course I'll help. Charles can't say no to me, and Hodges will follow his lead. Shall we say tomorrow afternoon? My parlour's to Grandeur Cottage is perfect, all homey and unthreatening. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. Tomorrow at 3, then. And, Dolly, let's keep it light, no hint of suspicion. We're merely concerned neighbours, nothing more. The invitation was sent, and Charles's reply, delivered by post, was polite but guarded. He and Hodges would attend, grateful for the chance to address the villagers' concerns. Miss Marple, reading the note, noted the careful wording, the faint tremor in the signature. Charles was wary, but he could not refuse without fueling more talk. She spent the evening preparing, her mind as precise as her stitches, rehearsing the questions that would pierce their defences. The next afternoon, Miss Marple's cottage was a picture of warmth, the fire crackling, the tea tray laden with scones and her best porcelain. Mrs Bantry arrived early, her chatter a lively counterpoint to Miss Marple's quiet focus. At precisely 3, Charles, Trent and Hodges appeared at the gate, their figures stark against the frosty lane. Charles, in a dark overcoat, carried himself with his usual polish, but his eyes were shadowed, his smile a touch defixed. Hodges, in his workman's cap and rough jacket, followed a step behind, his face impassive but his hands clenched at his sides. Miss Marple, greeting them at the door, noted the tension between them, a silent current that spoke of shared secrets. "Mr. Trent, Mr. Hodges," she said, her voice warm, "how kind of you to come. The village has been so troubled since dear Eleanor's passing, and we thought a chat might ease minds." "Do come in." Charles inclined his head, his charm on full display. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, you're most thoughtful. I know the gossip has been unkind, and I'm eager to set it right. Hodges and I are at your service." They settled in the parlour, Charles on the sofa beside Mrs. Bantry, Hodges in a straight-backed chair near the door, as if poised for flight. Miss Marple poured tea, her movements deliberate, her eyes noting every detail, Charles's fingers drumming on his knee, Hodges's gaze flicking to the window. Mrs. Bantry, playing her part, launched into village pleasantries. Her chatter about the fete and the vicar's new hymnals, a soft backdrop to Miss Marple's silent calculations. "The village does talk. Mr. Trent," Miss Marple said at last, her tone mild as she passed a scone. "It's natural, after such a loss. Folk have mentioned lights in Willow Cottage at night, and Mr. Hodges seen in the quarry. And then there's talk of your plans for London, or even abroad. It's all rather unsettling, you see." Charles's smile tightened, but he leaned forward, his voice smooth. "I understand, Miss Marple. Grief makes people see shadows where there are none. The lights, well, I've been sorting Eleanor's things, late into the night. It's painful work, but necessary. As for London, I'm merely settling her estate, consulting solicitors." And Hodges, he glanced at the caretaker, a flicker of warning in his eyes, "has been tending the grounds, as always. The quarry, I believe, is where he gathers stones for the garden paths." Hodges nodded, his voice low. "That's right, ma'am. Stones for the paths. I work late sometimes, to keep the place tidy. No harm in it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her voice was grave. "Of course, Mr. Hodges, your work is admirable, though I did hear of a box buried there, and cleaning fluid used in the lodge most curious, for a gardener. And then there's the matter of a letter found in the cottage, written by Mrs. Trent before her death. It was to her solicitor, I believe, and quite revealing." The air in the parlour thickened, the fire's crackle suddenly loud. Charles's hand froze on his cup, his face paling, and Hodges's fingers tightened on the chair's arms, his eyes narrowing. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the shift, fell silent, her gaze darting to Miss Marple. The letter, unmentioned until now, was Miss Marple's gambit, and she watched its impact with the precision of a chess master. "A letter," Charles said, his voice a shade too bright. "Eleanor was always writing notes, family matters, nothing more. If it was to her solicitor, it's likely about her will, which I'm handling. She was fanciful sometimes, poor dear, especially when unwell." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile gentle but unyielding. "Fanciful, perhaps, but specific. She wrote of fears, Mr. Trent, of you and Mr. Hodges, and of the wealth that might drive such fears. It's a troubling thing to find such words from a woman now dead. And then there's the medicine bottle in her room, the glass untouched. The stain on the carpet's more things, but they linger in the mind." Charles laughed, a brittle sound that echoed in the quiet. Miss Marple, you've been reading too many novels. Eleanor's heart failed as Dr. Haydock confirmed. The stain spilled tea, nothing more. Hodges cleaned it, didn't you? He turned to the caretaker, his eyes hard. Hodges nodded, his voice flat. Tea, ma'am. Clumsy of me. I cleaned it proper, like Mr. Trent asked. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Hodges, her eyes piercing. And the cleaning fluid, Mr. Hodges, the paraffin, the buried box, the letter to Leeds. You're a man of many tasks, it seems, and some quite unusual. I wonder, too, about your time in Yorkshire, at Blackthorn Hall. A theft, I hear, and a sudden departure. Past and present, Mr. Hodges, have a way of meeting. Hodges's face darkened, his hand twitching toward his pocket before he caught himself. Yorkshire's long ago, ma'am. I'm a gardener now, nothing more. You're mistaken about any box or letters. I do my job, that's all. Charles rose, his charm fraying. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, this is becoming absurd. Village gossip is one thing, but these accusations, Eleanor's death was a tragedy, not a crime. I must ask you to stop this, for her sake. Mrs. Bantry, her role as hostess, strained, interjected. Oh, Mr. Trent, we mean no harm. It's just the talk, you see it unsettles people. Miss Marple only wants to help. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it cut through the tension. Help, indeed. But truth, Mr. Trent, is a stubborn thing. I mentioned poison earlier, perhaps with its bitter scent. Dr. Haydock noticed it, you know, in Eleanor's room. And Mr. Hodges, with his knowledge of chemicals from Blackthorn Hall, might know such things. A drop in a glass, a swift end. It's not so hard, is it? Hodges stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. I've had enough, ma'am. I'm no poisoner. I've work to do. He strode to the door, his cap pulled low, and was gone. Before Charles could speak, Charles, his face flushed, set down his cup with a clink. Miss Marple, you've upset my man and me. I'll not stay for more of this. Good day. He followed Hodges, his steps quick, and the door shut with a thud. Mrs. Bantry exhaled, her eyes wide. Jane, you were magnificent. Did you see their faces? Charles looked like he'd seen a ghost, and Hodges, well, he bolted like a fox. That letter, though, did you really find it? Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. I did, Dolly. And it says what I implied. Eleanor feared them both, and her fear was justified. Their reactions, Charles's denial, Hodges's flight. Tell me, they're hiding something. But we must be careful. They're rattled, and rattled men are dangerous. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, a crash shattered the quiet. A stone, hurled through her parlour window, lay amid broken glass, a scrap of paper tied to it. She retrieved it with steady hands, unfolding it to read. Stop prying, old woman, or you'll regret it. The writing was crude, the threat clear, but Miss Marple's heart was steady. The stone was proof she had struck a nerve, and Charles, or Hodges, or both, were desperate. She summoned Inspector Slack the next morning, showing him the stone but not the letter, knowing its time would come. A prank, perhaps, she said, her tone mild, but it followed my talk with Mr. Trent and Hodges. They were upset, Inspector, by questions about Mrs. Trent's death. Slack, his skepticism warring with respect, took the stone. Look into it, Miss Marple, but you're stirring a hornet's nest. If there's trouble at Willow Cottage, I'll find it, not you. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes keen. "Of course, Inspector. I only ask questions, nothing more." As Slack left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. The confrontation had worked. Charles's mask had slipped Hodges's nerve, had cracked, and the stone was their confession of fear. She thought of Eleanor's letter, its trembling words, and of the quarry where Hodges hid his secrets. The game was perilous now, but she was ready, her mind a blade honed by truth. Chapter 10. The trap. The winter's breath had settled over St. Mary Mead, dusting the village with a fine sheen of frost that glittered under the pale morning sun. Willow Cottage, its ivy now brittle and its chimneys cold, stood as a silent sentinel. At the edge of Lilac Lane, its secrets pressed against the darkened panes. The confrontation at Miss Jane Marple's cottage had left a mark, not only in the shattered window and the threatening note, but in the air of St. Mary Mead itself, where whispers had grown into murmurs of suspicion. Miss Marple, her parlour tidied, and her resolve unshaken, sat by the fire, her knitting a gentle rhythm against the ticking of the clock. The stone through her window was a sin. Charles, Trent, and Hodges were cornered, and cornered men, she knew, made mistakes. It was time to set a trap, to draw them into the open and let their own fears betray them. The letter from Eleanor, its trembling words naming Charles and Hodges as threats, was Miss Marple's strongest weapon, but it was not enough. It pointed to motive Charles's greed for Eleanor's fortune and to Hodges's complicity with his chemical knowledge and quarry burials. Yet proof, the kind Inspector Slack would demand, was still elusive. The cyanide scent Dr. Haydock had noted, the stain Charles had concealed, the box Tom Sawyer had seen Hodges bury, these were threads, but they needed weaving into a net. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as her needles, turned to a strategy as old as human nature, to provoke a reaction, to spread a rumour so compelling that Charles and Hodges would act, revealing their guilt in their haste. Her plan required an ally. And Inspector Slack, though gruff and sceptical, was the man for the job. His visit after the stone-throwing incident had left him uneasy, his respect for Miss Marple's instincts warring with his reluctance to chase shadows. She invited him to tea the following afternoon, her cottage a haven of warmth against the chill outside. Slack arrived promptly, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression a mix of curiosity and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he began, settling into a chair, "that stone was no prank, I'll grant you. We found footprints in your boots, size 10, leading to the lane. Could be Hodges, could be Trent, could be a vagrant. But you've stirred something up, and I need to know what you're playing at." Miss Marple poured tea, her hands steady, her smile serene. "Playing, Inspector. I merely ask questions, as any neighbour might. But since you're here, I have a suggestion. The village is full of talk lights in Willow Cottage, Hodges' quarry visits, Mr. Trent's plans to flee abroad. Suppose we add a new rumour, one that might flush out the truth. Say, a witness who saw Hodges at the cottage the morning Mrs. Trent died, not just checking the boiler, but lingering in her room. If such a tale reached Charles and Hodges, they might react, meet, argue, reveal something." Slack's eyes narrowed, but a spark of interest flickered. "A trap, a risky, Miss Marple, and I don't like rumours without evidence. But I'll admit, your hunches have panned out before. Who's this witness, and how do we spread the word?" Miss Marple's lips curved. "No real witness, Inspector, just a story. Let it slip at the post office, where Miss Weatherby will ensure it spreads. Say the witness is a villager, unnamed for now, who saw Hodges at dawn acting strangely. If Charles or Hodges hear it, they may panic, and panic, as you know, breeds errors. Slack rubbed his chin, his skepticism softening. Clever, I'll give you that. I'll have Constable Polk mention it to Miss Weatherby, casual-like, and I'll keep men watching Willow, Cottage, and the lodge. But if this goes wrong, Miss Marple, it's on you. No more stones through windows, understand? Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. I understand, Inspector, but truth, like a fox, needs chasing to be caught. Slack left, his steps brisk, and Miss Marple turned to her next task, ensuring the rumour took root. She called on Mrs Bantry, whose knack for gossip was unmatched, and shared the plan with careful omissions. Dolly, she said over sherry, at the manor house, there's talk of a witness to Hodges's movements the morning Eleanor died. I've asked Inspector Slack to look into it, but you might mention it to Miss Weather, be discreetly, of course. The village deserves to know if there's truth to it. Mrs Bantry's eyes gleamed. Jane, you're a marvel. I'll drop a word at the post office tomorrow, nothing overt, just a hint. If Charles or Hodges hear it, they'll be jumping like cats on a hot roof. What do you expect them to do? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I expect, Dolly, that they will show their hands. Men with secrets dislike scrutiny, and scrutiny is what we shall give them. By evening, the rumour was sown. Miss Weatherby, true to form, had spread the tale with the efficiency of a telegraph, and by the next morning, the village hummed with it. At the grocer's, Mr Polk reported overhearing Charles at the bank, his voice sharp as he questioned the clerk about urgent transfers. At the tea shop, Mrs Hartnell claimed Hodges had been seen pacing outside the lodge, his face drawn. Miss Marple, knitting by her window, listened to Lily's breathless updates, her heart steady but alert. The trap was set, and now she needed to spring it. She resolved to place herself at Willow Cottage, to be the eyes that caught the reaction. With Mrs Bantry's help, she secured an invitation to call on Charles, ostensibly to return a book Eleanor had lent her a fiction, but a plausible one. The visit was set for late afternoon, and Miss Marple prepared with care, tucking Eleanor's letter into her bag as a talisman, though she would not show it yet. Inspector Slack, informed of her plan, agreed to station Constable Polk nearby, hidden in the woods, to watch for any sudden moves by Charles or Hodges. The walk to Willow Cottage was brisk, the air sharp with frost. Mrs Bantry, her arm linked, with Miss Marple's, chattered about the rumour, her excitement barely contained. Jane, it's working. Miss Weatherby says Charles was at the post office this morning, looking like thunder, asking who this witness was. Hodges was with him, silent but twitchy. You've got them rattled. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the cottage's gate. Rattled, Dolly, is what we want. Now, let's be gracious guests and see what they reveal. Charles met them at the door, his charm strained, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. Mrs Bantry, Miss Marple, he said, his voice tight. A pleasure, though I'm afraid I'm rather busy. This book Lena's, you say? I'll take it, and thank you. Miss Marple, holding the book, a volume of poetry, borrowed from her own shelf, smiled gently. Might we come in for a moment, Mr Trent? The village is so unsettled, with this new talk of a witness. We thought a word with you might calm things. Charles hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he stepped aside. Very well, but only a moment. The rumours are nonsense, as you must know. The drawing room was colder than before, the fire unlit, and Miss Marple noted the disarray, a stack of papers on the table, a half-packed crate in the corner. Charles's plans for departure, it seemed, were accelerating. Hodges was absent, but his presence lingered in the polished floors, the neatly trimmed roses visible through the window. Miss Marple settled onto the sofa, her bag at her side, and Mrs Bantry, sensing the moment's weight, kept her chatter light, praising the garden while watching Charles. "The witness, Mr Trent," Miss Marple said at last, her tone mild, "is said to have seen Mr Hodges at dawn in Mrs Trent's room the morning she died. It's a troubling claim, is it not? And with the talk of cyanide, the stain in her room, the letter she wrote, well, folk do wonder." Charles's face paled, his hands clenching. "Letter, witness. This is madness, Miss Marple. Eleanor died of heart failure. Dr Haydock said so. Hodges was checking the boiler, nothing more. You're letting gossip run wild." Before Miss Marple could reply, the door burst open, and Hodges stormed in, his cap gone, his eyes wild. "Trent, you fool," he shouted, his voice raw. "You said this would be clean, but now there's a witness. You've betrayed me, left me to hang while you take the money." Charles spun, his composure shattered. "Shut up, Hodges. You're making it worse. There's no witness, it's a lie, a trick to trap us." His voice rose, and he advanced on Hodges, his fists clenched. "You supplied the cyanide, you mixed it in her water, don't pin this on me." Miss Marple's heart leaped, but her face remained serene. Mrs Bantry gasped, her hand to her mouth, and from the hall, a shadow moved Constable Polk, stepping forward with Slack at his side, their faces grim. "That's enough, gentlemen," Slack said, his voice like iron. "You've said plenty, and we've heard it. Charles Trent, John Hodges, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Trent." Charles froze, his eyes darting to the door, but Polk blocked his path. Hodges, his strength sapped, slumped against the wall, his face ashen. Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped elegantly, her voice calm. "Inspector, I believe you'll find evidence in the courier box, perhaps with traces of cyanide, and in the lodge, cleaning fluid and burned papers. Mrs Trent's letter, I'll provide it names their intent." Slack nodded, his respect for Miss Marple now unguarded. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. Poke, cuff them, and search the cottage. We'll dig up that quarry tonight." As Charles and Hodges were led away, Charles's eyes met Miss Marple's, a mix of rage and defeat. "You're a meddlesome old woman," he spat, but she only smiled, her gaze steady. Mrs Bantry, recovering, linked arms with her as they stepped into the frosty air. "Jane, you're a wonder," they confessed, right there, like rats in a trap. "How did you know?" Miss Marple's lips curved. "I knew, Dolly, that guilt is a heavy burden, and fear makes it heavier. The rumour was the spark, and their own words, the flame." She did not mention the letter's trembling words, nor the nights spent weaving her net, but her heart was light. Eleanor's truth had prevailed, and Willow Cottage's shadows were lifting. Chapter 11. The confession. The winter's grip on St. Mary Mead had tightened. The frost etching delicate patterns on the villagers' windows, and the air sharp with the promise of snow. Willow Cottage, once a beacon of quiet elegance, now stood forlorn, its gates locked and its gardens untended, a mute witness to the drama that had unfolded within its walls. The arrest of Charles Trent and John Hodges had sent ripples through the village, transforming whispers into exclamations of shock and vindication. Miss Jane Marple, her parlour warmed by a steady fire, sat with her knitting in her lap, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the tumult of her thoughts. The trap she had set cunningly baited with a fabricated witness had sprung, and the men's blurted accusations in the heat of confrontation had sealed their fate. Yet Miss Marple knew that a confession, however damning, was only the beginning. The full truth of Eleanor Trent's murder lay in the details, and she was determined to see them laid bare. The village, ever eager to dissect its scandals, buzzed with the news of the arrests. At the post office, Miss Weatherby recounted Charles's ashen face as he was led away, her pince-nez glinting with satisfaction. At the tea shop, Mrs. Hartnell declared she had always known Hodges was no good, her voice carrying over the clink of cups. Miss Marple, listening to Lily's breathless updates, sifted through the chatter for substance, her mind fixed on the quarry, the lodge, and the letter that had sparked her pursuit. Eleanor's words, trembling urgent, had named her killers, but the how and why of their plot remained a tapestry half-woven, and Miss Marple was not one to leave threads dangling. Inspector Slack, for all his gruffness, had acted swiftly after. The confrontation, the quarry had been searched that night, and a small metal box, buried beneath loose earth, was unearthed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a vial with traces of a crystalline substance, cyanide. The police chemist confirmed, and a scrap of paper with chemical notations in Hodges's cramped hand. The lodge yielded more, a bottle of cleaning fluid, its label stained with use, and ashes in the fireplace, from which fragments of burned letters were salvaged, their contents too charred to read but suggestive of haste. Eleanor's letter, now in Slack's possession, was the cornerstone of the case, its accusations corroborated by the men's own words. Yet Slack, meeting with Miss Marple the morning after the arrests, was not content. "Miss Marple," he said, pacing her parlour, his notebook open, "you've handed me a case on a platter. I'll give you that. Trent and Hodges are in custody, and their shouting match at the cottage is enough to hang them. But I need the full story, how they did it, why, and what tied them together. They're not talking, not yet." Trent's clammed up, playing the gentleman, and Hodges just glares. "What do you know that I don't?" Miss Marple poured tea, her hands steady, her smile serene. "Inspector, I know only what the village and my own eyes have shown me. But men like Charles, Trent, and Hodges do not act without reason, and reason, in my experience, is often rooted in greed or fear. Let us consider what we have: a fortune passing to Charles, a caretaker with a thief's past and a poisoner's. Knowledge, a letter naming them both. I suspect, if you press Hodges, he will break first. A man who feels betrayed, as he did at Willow Cottage, is a man with little to lose." Slack's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "You're right about Hodges's the weaker link. I'll lean on him today, see what he spills. But you're holding something back, Miss Marple. That letter, how did you know to look for it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A woman's intuition, Inspector, and a maid's memory." Elsie, from Willow Cottage, recalled Eleanor's urgency. "The rest was patience. But do tell me what you find from Hodges. His past, I think, will explain much." Slack left, his steps purposeful, and Miss Marple turned to her knitting, her mind racing. She recalled Hodges's outburst, his accusation that Charles had promised a clean job, his fear of being left to hang. Hodges, she suspected, was no mastermind but a tool, wielded by Charles's ambition and bound by some shared secret. Her thoughts turned to Blackthorn Hall, where Hodges had been dismissed for theft, and to the apothecary work that followed, honing his knowledge of poisons. Charles, with his debts and his charm, had found in Hodges a man both useful and expendable, and Eleanor's fortune had been the prize. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vic, where Mrs. Clement, arranging hymnals, offered a new perspective. "I've been thinking of Eleanor," she said, her voice soft. "She came to me a week before she died, asking about confession, not in the formal sense, but as a way to unburden herself. She seemed frightened, said she'd learned something about Charles that changed everything. I urged her to speak, but she left, promising to return. She never did." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained bland. "Frightened, you say? Did she mention Hodges, or anything specific?" Mrs. Clement shook her head. "Only that she felt alone, even in her own home. I thought it was her health. But now, I wonder if she knew too much." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her thoughts on Eleanor's fear, so like the trembling words of her letter. At the grocer's, Mr. Polk's wife added another piece. "I heard from the bank. Clerk in Danamoth," she said, stacking tins. "Charles was in last month, asking about loans against an expected inheritance. Said his wife's trust would clear his debts, once it was his. Bold as brass, he was. Debts, Miss Marple thought, were a motive as old as time and Charles's. Boldness suggested a man certain of his prize." She recalled his trembling hands at Willow Cottage, his quick step to cover the stain. Hodges, with his cyanide and his cleaning, had been his instrument, but the plan was Charles's, born of desperation and greed. She needed Hodges to confirm it, to lay bare the mechanics of their plot, and she trusted Slack's pressure would yield results. By evening, Slack returned, his face a mix of triumph and fatigue. He settled into Miss Marple's parlour, accepting a cup of tea with a grunt. "You were right about Hodges," he said, flipping open his notebook. "He cracked this afternoon, after I showed him the quarry box and mentioned the cyanide. Turned on Trent like a cornered dog, spilled the whole story. I'll need you to hear it. Miss Marple, you'll spot any holes." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes keen. "I'm all ears, Inspector. What did Mr. Hodges say?" Slack leaned forward, his voice low. "Hodges says it started a year ago, when Trent hired him for Willow Cottage. Trent was drowning in debts, gambling, bad investments, the lot. He'd married Eleanor for her fortune, knowing it was tied up in a trust till her death. Hodges, fresh from a rough patch in Yorkshire, was desperate for work, and Trent saw his chance. He learned of Hodges's past Blackthorn Hall, the theft. The apothecary workhand offered a deal, help him secure the fortune, and they'd split a share." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning with Hodges's tale. "And the plan, Inspector? How did they choose cyanide?" Slack's eyes gleamed. "That was Hodges's doing. He'd worked with chemicals in Yorkshire, knew cyanide from his apothecary days, said it was quick, hard to trace without an autopsy, and mimicked Eleanor's heart condition. Trent staged her illness, small doses of digitalis, enough to make her seem frail. Hodges got the cyanide from a contact in Leeds, mixed it in a tonic bottle to mask the taste. The night before she died, Trent was in London, establishing his alibi, but he'd left the doctored tonic with Hodges. Hodges slipped into Eleanor's room at midnight, swapped her medicine for the cyanide dose, and left her to drink it. She was dead by dawn, and he played the shocked caretaker, fetching Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind on the untouched glass, the stain Charles had covered. "And the stain, Inspector? The cleaning fluid?" Slack nodded. "Hodges admitted to spilling a drop when he swapped the bottles, clumsy," he said. "He cleaned it later, after Dr. Haydock left, using the fluid we found in the lodge." The box in the quarry was his insurance cyanide and notes, in case Trent double-crossed him. He burned letters in the fireplace, 2 orders from Trent detailing the plan. He kept quiet till our rumour about the witness. Thought Trent had betrayed him, set him up to take the fall. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her voice was grave. And Charles, did Hodges say how they met, or what bound them? Slack flipped a page. Met through a mutual acquaintance in London, a shady type who knew Hodges's past. Trent needed someone discreet, and Hodges needed money. It was greed, pure and simple. Trent for the fortune, Hodges for a cut. But Hodges claims Eleanor suspected something. She'd overheard them arguing about money, started asking questions. That's why they acted when they did. She was getting too close. Miss Marple's heart ached for Eleanor, her fear confirmed by Mrs. Clement's tale and her letter's trembling words. Poor Eleanor, she murmured. She tried to warn us, but too late. And Charles, has he spoken? Slack shook his head. Not a word, but Hodges's confession is enough. We've got the vial, the letter, their own words at the cottage. Trent's done for, and he knows it. Trial's set for next month, and I'll need you to testify, Miss Marple, about the letter, the confrontation, the lot. Miss Marple nodded, her resolve firm. I'll be there, Inspector, for Eleanor's sake, and for truth. Slack rose, his notebook tucked away. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'd have missed half this without you. But no more traps, eh? Leave the rest to us. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind but sharp. No more traps, Inspector. Only stitches, to mend what's torn. As Slack left, Miss Marple took up her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet. Hodges's confession had filled the gaps. Cyanide source, the staged illness, Eleanor's suspicions. She thought of Charles, his charm a mask for desperation, and Hodges, his past a chain that bound him to crime. The villagers' whispers, her own quiet probing, had led her here, and Eleanor's letter had been the spark. She recalled the stone through her window, the threat scrawled in haste, and knew it was Hodges's work, his fear spilling over. Charles, Calder, had planned to flee, his funds already shifting abroad. The next day, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bantry, whose manor house was alive with the villagers' triumph. Over tea, Mrs. Bantry pressed for details, her eyes wide. Jane, it's the talk of St. Mary Mead. Hodges confessing. Charles caught, they say, he was planning to sail for America. How did you do it? Miss Marple's lips curved. I listened. Dolly and I waited. Men like Charles and Hodges carry their guilt like stones, and stones, when shaken, fall. Eleanor's letter was her voice, and I only helped it be heard. Mrs. Bantry sighed, her admiration unguarded. You're a wonder, Jane. The village owes you and Eleanor, too. As Miss Marple walked home under a sky heavy with clouds, her thoughts turned to Willow Cottage. Its secrets were exposed, its shadows banished, but its heart remained Eleanor, a woman who had fought to be heard. The confession had closed the case, but Miss Marple's work was not done. She would testify, her words, a final stitch in the tapestry of truth. The game, she thought, was won, but its cost was heavy, and she carried it with quiet grace. Chapter 12. The village restored. The winter's hold on St. Mary Mead had deepened. The village cloaked in a frost that turned the lanes to glass and the hedgerows to lace. Willow Cottage, its gates now chained and its windows boarded, stood as a relic of the tragedy that had gripped the village, its once vibrant gardens withered under the season's chill. The arrest and confession of Charles Trent and John Hodges had quelled the storm of whispers, replacing them with a quieter satisfaction, a sense that justice, though hard-won, had prevailed. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with a fire, casting soft shadows, worked at her knitting, the gentle click of her needles a steady rhythm against the silence. The case was closed, the truth laid bare, yet her mind lingered on Eleanor Trent, whose courage had sparked the unravelling of a deadly plot. The village was healing, but Miss Marple knew that restoration required more than verdicts required understanding, and she was not yet done reflecting. The trial, set for the following month, loomed as a formality for Hodges's confession, had been thorough, corroborated by the cyanide vial, the burned letters, and Eleanor's own written warning. Charles, silent in custody, faced a future dimmed by his own greed, his charm no match for the evidence stacked against him. The village, ever quick to reclaim its rhythm, had turned its talk to mundane matters, the vicar's new roof fund, the Christmas pageant, but Miss Marple, with her keen sense of human nature, saw the undercurrents still at play, the awe at her own role, the lingering unease about Willow Cottage, the quiet pride in a community that had seen truth triumph. She sifted these currents as she sifted her wool, seeking the final threads to complete her tapestry. Her morning began with a walk to the post office, her shawl wrapped tightly against the cold. Miss Weatherby, sorting letters with her usual vigour, greeted her with a nod and a gleam in her eye. "Miss Marple, you're the talk of St. Mary Mead," she said, pushing her pince-nez up her nose. "They say you caught those villains with nothing but a letter and your wits. I saw Charles Trent's face when they took him white as chalk. He was, and Hodges looked like a trapped rat. The village owes you a debt." Miss Marple's smile was modest, her voice soft. "The village owes itself, Miss Weatherby. We all listen, in our way, and Eleanor's voice was the loudest. I only helped it carry." Miss Weatherby leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I heard from the bank clerk in Dannymouth. Debts were monstrous, gambling mostly, and he'd been dodging creditors for years. Eleanor's fortune was his lifeline, they say, and he planned to sell Willow Cottage the moment it was his. As for Hodges, my cousin in Leeds wrote that he'd been a troublemaker even after Blackthorn, Hall petty theft, shady deals. No wonder he fell in with Trent." Miss Marple nodded, filing the details away. Debts and desperation had driven Charles, while Hodges's past had made him a willing tool. She thanked Miss Weatherby and continued her circuit, her steps taking her past the churchyard, where Mr. Clement, the vicar, was clearing frost from the path. His gentle face brightened at her approach, and he paused to chat, his breath clouding in the air. "Miss Marple," he said, leaning on his broom, "you've done a great service. Eleanor's death weighed on us all, but knowing her killers, our court brings peace. I've been thinking of her, how she came to me, frightened, wanting to confess something. I wish I'd pressed her, but your work has honoured her memory." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. She tried to speak, Mr. Clement, and in her letter she did. Courage, even in fear, is a powerful thing. Did she ever mention anything else, perhaps about her marriage or Hodges? The vicar shook his head. "Only that she felt watched, even in her own home. I thought it was her illness, but now I see it was more. Charles was so charming, and Hodges so quiet now. One suspected. You saw what we missed." Miss Marple's lips curved. "I saw, Mr. Clement, because I looked. A village is like a book. Every page tells a story, if you read closely." She bid him goodbye and moved on, her thoughts on Eleanor's fear so palpable in her letter's trembling ink. The letter, now with Inspector Slack, was her legacy, and Miss Marple felt a quiet pride in having been its bearer. At the grocer's, Mrs. Polk, stacking jars of jam, offered another perspective. "Miss Marple, you're a marvel," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "My husband heard from the police in Dannymoth. They found more in Hodges's lodge, you know. A ledger hidden under the floorboards with notes on money. Trent promised him half a share of Eleanor's fortune. Can you believe it? And a train ticket to Liverpool, dated for next week. They were planning to bolt, both of them." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained bland. A ledger and a ticket proof of their pact and their flight. She thanked Mrs. Polk and continued to the tea shop, where Mrs. Hartnell and her circle were dissecting the case with relish. Miss Marple, joining them with a pot of Earl Grey, listened as Mrs. Hartnell expounded. "I always said Hodges was shifty," she declared, her voice carrying. "And Trent, with his fine manners, pure deceit. My nephew saw them arguing in the lodge, days before the arrest, shouting about money. You caught them just in time, Miss Marple." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind on the ledger, the ticket, the argument. "The village saw much, Mrs. Hartnell," she said, her tone mild. "Your nephew's eyes, Miss Weatherby's ears, Elsie's memory, we all played a part. Eleanor's truth was too strong to stay hidden." The women nodded, their admiration unguarded, and Miss Marple left, her thoughts turning to Willow Cottage. The house, shuttered and silent, was a wound in the village's heart, but its story was nearly complete. She recalled the cyanide vial, the stain Charles had covered, the box in the quarry edge, a piece of the plot that had ended Eleanor's life. Charles's debts, Hodges's greed, Eleanor's suspicions, these were the forces that had collided, and Miss Marple's quiet persistence had brought them to light. That afternoon, she called on Mrs. Bantry, whose manor house was a haven of warmth and gossip. Mrs. Bantry, pouring sherry, was eager for details, her eyes wide with delight. "Jane, you're the hero of St. Mary Mead," she exclaimed, settling onto a chaise. "The whole village is talking Charles and Hodges, caught by your clever trap. I heard from my maid that the police found a false bottom in Trent's desk, stuffed with letters to a creditor in London, begging for time. He was desperate, Jane, and you saw it all." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her voice soft. "I saw Dolly because Eleanor showed me. Her letter was her courage, written in fear but strong enough to break them. Charles planned, Hodges acted, but they underestimated a woman's will." Mrs. Bantry shivered, her sherry glass pausing. "It's chilling, Jane, to think they lived among us, plotting such a thing. That cyanide Hodges knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he? And Charles, with his smiles, thinking he'd sail off with her money. What will happen to Willow Cottage now?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the village lay under its frost. "The cottage will wait, Dolly, as houses do. Someone new will come, and the roses will bloom again. But Eleanor's story will linger, a reminder that evil, however clever, cannot hide forever." Mrs. Bantry sighed, her admiration plain. "You're right, as always. But tell me, how did you know the rumour would work? That witness story, it was genius." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Guilt, Dolly, is a restless thing. Charles and Hodges carried it like a weight, and the rumour was a nudge to make them stumble. Their own words did the rest." As she left the manor, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air thick with the scent of coming snow. Miss Marple's steps were light, her heart steady, but her thoughts lingered on Eleanor, a woman who had sensed her danger, who had written her truth in a trembling hand, who had trusted the world to hear her. She was the heart of this victory. Miss Marple recalled the stone through her window, the threat scrawled in Hodges's fear, and knew it was a small price for justice. She thought of Charles, his debts a chain that bound him to murder, and Hodges, his past a path to poison. The village had seen them in its quiet way, and she had been its voice. Her evening was spent with Inspector Slack, who called to finalize her role in the trial. He settled into her parlour, his notebook worn from use, his respect for Miss Marple now open. "The case is airtight," he said, accepting a cup of tea. Hodges's confession, the cyanide vial, Eleanor's letter, the ledger, it's more than we need. Trent's still silent, but his creditors are talking, and they paint a grim picture. "You'll testify about the letter and the confrontation, Miss Marple, and that'll clinch it." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting resumed. "I'll testify, Inspector, for Eleanor. She deserved better than to be a pawn in their greed. Tell me, what of the fortune? Will it be tied up in Charles's debts?" Slack shrugged. "Likely, though there's talk of a distant cousin inheriting what's left. The trust was clear. Charles got it only if Eleanor died, but his crimes void that. The lawyers will sort it, but Willow Cottage is empty for now." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts on the cottage's future. "Empty, but not forgotten. The village will heal, Inspector, as it always does. We're stronger for it." Slack rose, his notebook tucked away. "You're a wonder, Miss Marple. St. Mary Mead's lucky to have you. But no more traps, eh? My heart can't take it." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, her eyes kind. "No more traps, Inspector. Only tea, and perhaps a new scarf for the winter." As Slack left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The village was restored, its balance tipped back to peace. But Eleanor's shadow lingered, a reminder of courage in the face of betrayal. She thought of the letter, its smudged ink a testament to a woman's fight, and of the quarry where Hodges's secrets had been unearthed. Charles and Hodges, bound by greed, had underestimated St. Mary Mead, its quiet eyes and listening ears. Miss Marple's role was done, but her heart carried Eleanor's story, a quiet tribute to a life reclaimed. The snow began to fall as she rose to draw the curtains, soft flakes drifting past her window. Willow Cottage, she knew, would find new life, and St. Mary Mead would move on, its stories woven into its stones. She returned to her knitting, her needles a prayer for peace, and the village slept under its winter veil, restored but ever watchful.